The crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across 300 masked faces. But Duchess Vivian Ashcombe could feel every eye in the ballroom waiting for her to break. They'd come to her estate not for champagne or waltzes, but for blood, the kind that pools slowly beneath a marriage everyone knows is rotting from the inside. For months, whispers had followed her through London drawing rooms like smoke. The Duke keeps a woman in Mayfair. The Duchess pretends not to know. But tonight, while violins wept and lords twirled their mistresses across polished marble, Vivian heard something that stopped her heart. A melody drifting from her husband's locked study, thin and mechanical. The song from the music box Cedric had given her on their wedding night. The box that should have been in her chambers. The box she hadn't touched in 2 years. And when she finally stood alone in that study, the small golden thing open in her trembling hands, she found what he'd hidden beneath the velvet lining. A miniature portrait of a woman whose face she'd never seen, whose beauty made her stomach turn, and whose existence shattered every lie Vivian had ever told herself about survival. Stay with me. What happens next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about power, betrayal, and the things a woman will do when the world demands she smile through her own destruction. The morning after the masquerade, Vivian woke to an empty bed and a headache that felt like iron spikes driven behind her eyes. Cedric hadn't come home. Again. She lay there staring at the canopy above her, the damask curtains that cost more than a tenant farmer would earn in 5 years, and she thought about how expensive it was to be humiliated. Her lady's maid, Mary, entered with tea and the morning papers. The girl's hands shook slightly as she set the tray down. Everyone in the household could taste it now, the rot. "You look tired, my lady. Shall I draw you a bath?" Vivian sat up slowly, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "No, bring me the household accounts. All of them. And Mary, did His Grace return last night?" Mary's eyes dropped. "No, my lady. Mr. Graves said the Duke sent word he was staying at his club." His club. The lie was so casual it almost made Vivian laugh. She'd ridden past the club 3 nights ago. His carriage wasn't there. "Thank you, Mary. That will be all." When the girl left, Vivian poured herself tea with steady hands and opened the music box she'd brought from the study. In daylight, the portrait looked even more damning. The woman was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair and a smile that suggested she knew exactly what she was taking. Vivian turned it over and read the inscription again. "Until London belongs to us both again. Again." As if they'd shared it once before. As if Vivian herself was the interloper. She set the portrait aside and thought about the women she'd known who'd faced this. Lady Pemberton, who'd drunk herself into a stupor and died at 43. Mrs. Harlow, who'd borne it silently and watched her husband father 3 bastards with a governess. The Countess of Ware, who'd taken lovers of her own and been exiled from society for her honesty. There was no good path, only variations of destruction. But Vivian wasn't those women. She'd survived 10 years in a marriage that had curdled from indifference into contempt, had learned to navigate drawing rooms where every smile hid a knife, had watched her husband grow powerful while she was reduced to an ornament he occasionally displayed. She'd swallowed it all. And she was done swallowing. The Ashcombe estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of Yorkshire moorland, all grey stone and wind-beaten elegance. It had belonged to Cedric's family for 8 generations, and Vivian had been brought here as a bride of 19, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Her father had called it a triumph, a minor gentry daughter marrying a duke. Her mother had cried and said nothing at all. Cedric had been charming then. 32 years old, handsome in that particular way English aristocrats managed, tall, fair-haired, with a smile that suggested both breeding and menace. He'd courted her with flowers and poetry, had kissed her hand at balls and made her believe she was special. The wedding had been a spectacle. The wedding night had been efficient, and then the mask had come off, slowly, like skin peeling from a burn. He wasn't cruel exactly. He didn't hit her, or rage at her, or lock her away. He simply stopped seeing her, stopped touching her, stopped pretending she mattered beyond her function as the Duchess, the woman who hosted his dinners and wore his jewels and produced no heirs because he rarely visited her bed. The first 2 years, she'd blamed herself. By the 5th, she'd stopped caring. By the 10th, she'd armored herself so completely she barely remembered what it felt like to be soft. But the music box, the portrait, the handwriting that suggested intimacy and history and a future that erased Vivian entirely, that cracked something she'd thought was already broken beyond repair. She spent the day in her sitting room, going through financial records Mary had quietly delivered. The household accounts were pristine, but there were gaps, payments to a solicitor in London, withdrawals Cedric had made personally, amounts that didn't correspond to any estate expense she recognized, not damning on their own, but enough to follow. That evening, she dressed for dinner in emerald silk, her hair pinned severely, her expression calm. Cedric arrived late, smelling of cigars and someone else's perfume. He barely looked at her. "Good evening, Vivian." "Cedric?" They ate in silence, the dining room vast and cold around them. Servants moved like ghosts. The clock ticked. Finally, he set down his wine glass. "I'll be in London again next week. Parliament business." "Of course." She kept her voice light, pleasant. "Will you be gone long?" "A few days. Perhaps a week." He met her eyes for the first time, and she saw it. The faint edge of guilt he couldn't quite hide. "You'll manage, I'm sure. I always do." He left the table early. She sat alone, finishing her wine, thinking about the woman in the portrait and the way Cedric's face had shifted when he'd lied. He'd always been a terrible liar. It was one of the few things about him she'd once found endearing. Vivian began her investigation the way women of her class always did, through servants, tradesmen, and the invisible networks that held aristocratic life together. She started with the coachman, an older man named Daniels who'd served the estate for 20 years and had a daughter Vivian had once helped place in a good household. "Mr. Daniels, I need to know where His Grace goes when he's in London." The man's face closed like a fist. "My lady, I don't think... I'm not asking you to betray him. I'm asking you to be honest with me." She softened her tone. "Please?" He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Mayfair, my lady. An address on Park Street. I've driven him there a dozen times these past 6 months. Sometimes he stays the night." She thanked him and moved on to the steward, who managed the London properties. There was no residence on Park Street in the Ashcombe holdings, which meant Cedric had rented it privately, which meant he was hiding it. Over the next 2 weeks, Vivian pieced together a picture that made her want to scream and vomit in equal measure. The apartment was leased under the name of a Mr. Edwards, a solicitor Cedric occasionally used for personal matters. The woman, according to a maid Vivian bribed with 2 months' wages, was named Genevieve Carrington, daughter of a disgraced politician who'd fled to the continent after a financial scandal 5 years prior. She was beautiful, educated, and ambitious, and she'd been Cedric's mistress for at least a year, possibly longer. But it was more than an affair. Vivian discovered payments to Genevieve's brother, a minor lord with gambling debts and political aspirations. She found correspondence, carefully coded but obvious to anyone looking, that suggested Cedric was planning to shift estate assets, create a separate trust, something that would give the Carringtons access to Ashcombe money and influence. He wasn't just betraying her. He was dismantling everything tied to the family name, everything that gave Vivian her position and protection. If he succeeded, she'd be left with nothing, a duchess in title only, dependent on his goodwill for survival. The realization didn't make her angry. It made her cold. On a Tuesday evening in early February, Vivian told Mary she had a headache and wanted to be left alone. Then she dressed in a plain wool cloak, pinned her hair beneath a servant's cap, and took a hired carriage to London. The city was a different animal at night, fog rolling through narrow streets, gaslight throwing oily shadows, the smell of coal smoke and horse dung, and something rotting beneath it all. She'd always hated London. It felt like a beast that devoured people slowly, grinding them down until nothing remained but ambition and decay. The apartment on Park Street was in a respectable building, the kind where wealthy men kept their mistresses, and everyone pretended not to notice. Vivian stationed herself in a doorway across the road, her heart hammering, her breath fogging in the cold air. She felt insane, reckless, alive. She didn't have to wait long. Cedric's carriage pulled up just after 9. He stepped out, spoke briefly to the driver, then walked to the building's entrance. He looked good, well-dressed, confident, the kind of man who believed the world existed to serve him. Vivian watched him disappear inside and felt something twist in her chest, something that was almost grief. 10 minutes later, a light appeared in a second-floor window. Vivian could see movement inside. Two figures, close together, the kind of intimacy that only comes from time and repetition. She couldn't see their faces. She didn't need to. She stood there in the freezing dark for an hour, maybe more, watching the window like a woman possessed. At some point, the figures moved away from view. The light stayed on, and Vivian finally turned and walked back to her carriage, her mind already 3 steps ahead. She returned to Yorkshire the next morning and spent 2 days locked in her study, reviewing documents, writing letters, building a case that would be impossible to ignore. The music box sat on her desk like a talisman. She opened it sometimes, just to hear the melody, just to remind herself why she was doing this. On the 3rd day, she received an invitation to the Royal Winter Gala, the event of the season, hosted by the Prince Regent himself, attended by every person of consequence in England. Cedric would be there, Genevieve would be there. And Vivian, for the first time in her life, would stop playing the role of the silent, suffering wife. She wrote her acceptance immediately. The days before the gala passed in a haze of preparation. Vivian commissioned a new gown, silver silk, not the Ashcombe blue Cedric preferred, and spent hours rehearsing what she would say, how she would stand, the exact expression she would wear when the world finally saw what she'd been carrying. Mary noticed the change. "My lady, are you well?" Vivian smiled. "I've never been better." It wasn't a lie. She felt sharp, focused, like a blade that had been honed for a single purpose. The fear was still there, terror, really, at what she was about to do. But it was drowned out by something stronger: rage, clarity, the absolute certainty that she would not be erased. Cedric returned from London 2 days before the gala. He found her in the drawing room reading. "You're coming to the gala, I assume?" "Of course." She didn't look up from her book. Wouldn't miss it. He studied her for a moment, as if sensing something had shifted but unable to name it. "Good. We'll travel together then." "As you wish." He left. She turned a page, and she thought about the portrait hidden in her trunk upstairs, waiting. The night before they were to leave for London, Vivian couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the moorland, the endless dark punctuated by distant lights from tenant cottages. She'd always found the landscape brutal, too open, too exposed, a place where nothing could hide. But tonight, it felt fitting. She thought about the girl she'd been at 19, walking into this house as a bride, believing marriage was a kind of salvation. She thought about the woman she'd become, polished, obedient, slowly suffocating under the weight of expectations she'd never chosen. And she thought about the woman she was about to be, standing in front of London's elite with the wreckage of her marriage in her hands, daring them to look away. There was no going back from this. She knew that. Once she walked into that ballroom and opened the music box, once she showed the world what Cedric had done, her life would detonate. She'd be whispered about, pitied, possibly ostracized. The rules of society were clear. A wronged wife was expected to endure in silence or retreat in shame. She was supposed to disappear, not fight back. But Vivian had spent 10 years disappearing, and she was done. She turned from the window, climbed into bed, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would set fire to everything, and she would not flinch. The journey to London took most of the day. Cedric spent it reading dispatches, occasionally making notes, completely absorbed in whatever political maneuvering consumed him. Vivian sat across from him in the carriage, watching the countryside roll past, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the cold, steady hum of purpose. They arrived at their London residence in the late afternoon. Vivian bathed, dressed, and prepared with the kind of meticulous care she usually reserved for the most important social occasions. But this wasn't about impressing anyone. This was about control. Every detail mattered. The fit of her gown, the way her hair was pinned, the exact placement of her jewelry. She would walk into that ballroom looking flawless, untouchable, so no one could dismiss her as hysterical or broken. When she came downstairs, Cedric was waiting in the foyer. He looked at her, and for a moment something like appreciation crossed his face. "You look well." "Thank you." They rode to the gala in silence. The palace was ablaze with light. Carriages lined up for blocks, the glittering crowd pouring through the entrance like a river of silk and jewels. Vivian stepped out, took Cedric's arm, and walked inside with her head high. The ballroom was everything excess could buy: crystal chandeliers, gold leaf molding, a full orchestra playing on a raised stage, hundreds of nobles in their finest attire. Vivian recognized faces from a decade of social engagements, lords and ladies who'd smiled at her, pitied her, whispered about her behind fans. They were all here, witnesses. Cedric guided her through the crowd, nodding to acquaintances, stopping to exchange pleasantries with men whose names Vivian barely remembered. She played her part perfectly, smiling, gracious, the ideal duchess. But her hand, hidden in the folds of her skirt, clutched a small velvet pouch. Inside was the music box. And across the ballroom, near the far entrance, Vivian saw her, Genevieve Carrington. She was exactly as beautiful as the portrait suggested, maybe more so. Auburn hair swept into an elegant twist, a gown of deep rose silk, her face animated as she spoke to a group of young lords who hung on her every word. She looked confident, happy, completely unaware that her life was about to implode. Vivian's pulse quickened. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her expression neutral. Not yet. She had to wait for the right moment. The orchestra was still playing. The Prince Regent hadn't made his entrance. She needed everyone's attention, not just part of it. Cedric leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "I need to speak with Lord Ashford. Will you be all right on your own for a moment?" "Of course." She smiled. "Take your time." He disappeared into the crowd. Vivian stood alone, the music box heavy in her hand, and counted her heartbeats. She could still stop this. She could put the box away, go home, live the rest of her life as the woman everyone expected her to be, silent, dignified, slowly dying inside. But then she looked across the room and saw Genevieve laugh at something a lord said, saw the way the woman's hand rested lightly on his arm, the ease with which she moved through a world that should have been Vivian's. And she thought, no, not anymore. The orchestra finished its piece. There was a brief pause, applause, the kind of lull that happens at every grand event when people shift and resettle and wait for what comes next. Vivian saw her moment. She walked to the center of the ballroom. Every step felt like walking off a cliff. The crowd parted for her, instinct, probably, the way people always made room for a duchess. And she reached the middle of the floor just as the conductor raised his baton for the next song. She turned, facing the room, and raised her hand. "Please." Her voice cut through the murmur of conversation, clear and steady. "Forgive the interruption, but I have something I'd like to share." The room went silent. Every eye turned toward her. She could see confusion on some faces, curiosity on others. Cedric, across the ballroom, froze mid-conversation. Vivian pulled the music box from the pouch and held it up. "Many of you may recognize this. It was a gift from my husband, the Duke of Ashcombe, on our wedding night 10 years ago. A symbol," he said, "of our loyalty and devotion." She opened the lid. The melody began to play, thin and delicate, each note like a needle in the sudden quiet. "I've treasured it." As I'm sure he intended, she let the music fill the silence for a moment, let people remember, let them start to wonder why she was doing this. Then she reached inside and lifted the false bottom. "But recently, I discovered something I hadn't known before." She held up the miniature portrait, turning it so the crowd could see. Hidden inside was this: a portrait of a woman I've never met, with an inscription that reads, "Until London belongs to us both again." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Vivian saw faces contort, shock, fascination, horror. She saw Cedric push through the crowd, his face white, and she saw Genevieve Carrington, standing near the far wall, her expression suddenly stricken. Vivian raised her voice. "Perhaps some of you know who this woman is. I didn't, at first, but I've learned quite a bit over the past few weeks. Her name is Genevieve Carrington, daughter of Thomas Carrington, the man who fled England 5 years ago after embezzling funds from his business partners. And she's been my husband's mistress for more than a year." The room erupted. Whispers turned to shouts, people craning to see Genevieve, who stood frozen like a deer in a hunter's sights. Cedric finally reached Vivian, his face twisted with rage and panic. "Vivian, what the hell are you doing?" But she stepped back, out of his reach, and kept talking. She hadn't come this far to stop now. I might have endured this quietly, as society expects. But then I discovered that my husband has been funneling Ashcombe assets to Miss Carrington's family, payments to her brother, a trust being established outside the estate, plans that would strip this family of the resources and influence it's held for generations. She looked directly at Cedric. Not just an affair, treason against his own name. The word hung in the air like smoke. Treason. She'd chosen it carefully. In aristocratic circles, family loyalty was everything. To betray your bloodline for a mistress and her disgraced relatives, it was unforgivable. Cedric's mouth opened and closed. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Vivian pulled a folded document from her bodice, a copy of a bank transfer, one of many she'd found. "This is just the beginning. I have letters, receipts, testimonies from servants and solicitors." She looked past him, addressing the crowd. "And I'll be presenting all of it to the appropriate authorities." Chaos. That was the only word for what happened next. Lords and ladies talking over each other, some rushing toward Genevieve, others clustering around Vivian and Cedric. Someone shouted for the guards. The orchestra sat frozen, instruments in hand, as if they'd forgotten how to move. And through it all, Vivian stood perfectly still, the music box silent in her hand, her heart hammering but her face calm. She'd done it. She'd detonated her life in front of everyone who mattered, and she felt fritastiki. The aftermath moved faster than Vivian expected. Palace guards escorted Genevieve Carrington out of the ballroom within minutes, her face buried in her hands, her gown trailing behind her like a banner of defeat. Cedric tried to follow, tried to spin some defense to the lords who cornered him, but his allies were already stepping back, distancing themselves from the wreckage. By the time the Prince Regent finally made his delayed entrance, fashionably late as always, the scandal was complete. Vivian spent the rest of the evening in a side chamber, answering questions from officials who wanted details, documents, anything that could substantiate her claims. She gave them everything: names, dates, figures. She'd prepared for this, and it showed. By midnight, there were whispers that Parliament would open an investigation into Cedric's financial dealings. She returned to the London residence alone. Cedric didn't come home that night, or the next. Servants moved through the house like ghosts, unsure who they were supposed to obey anymore. Vivian sat in the drawing room drinking tea, watching dawn break over the city, and wondered if she'd just destroyed herself along with her husband. But when the morning papers arrived, she found her answer. The headlines were brutal. Duchess exposes betrayal at royal gala. Ashcombe scandal rocks Parliament. Duke's mistress revealed. But beneath the sensationalism, something else emerged. Sympathy. Admiration, even. The articles painted Vivian not as a scorned wife, but as a woman of courage, someone who'd refused to be silenced. One editorial called her a force of nature. Another said she'd done what every wronged woman wished she could. It wasn't universal. There were still voices calling her reckless, unladylike, a threat to the social order. But she'd expected that. What mattered was the shift, the sense that she'd tapped into something larger, a frustration simmering beneath the surface of aristocratic life. All the women who'd been told to endure and smile and disappear. She wasn't alone anymore. And Cedric, for the first time in his life, was truly powerless. 2 days later, Vivian received a visitor at the London residence, a solicitor representing Cedric, asking for a private meeting. She agreed. The man was young, nervous, clearly out of his depth. He sat across from her in the drawing room, clutching a leather case like a shield. "Your Grace, I've been asked to convey the Duke's regrets. He wishes to resolve this matter as amicably as possible." Vivian poured herself tea, her movements unhurried. How generous of him. "He's prepared to offer a settlement, a separate residence for you, an annual allowance, full discretion regarding the events of the gala, if you would agree to a quiet separation." She sipped her tea. And what would he retain? The solicitor shifted. The estate, the title, full control of family assets. He cleared his throat. He believes this is more than fair, given what? That he's the one who committed betrayal? That he planned to strip the Ashcombe name of everything it's built? She set down her cup. Tell my husband I have no interest in his settlement. The estate is mine as much as his, and I intend to claim it. Your Grace, with respect, the law? The law will side with the Duke, yes, I'm aware. She leaned forward. But public opinion is a different matter. And right now, every newspaper in England is on my side. If Cedric wants a fight, I'll give him one. In court. In Parliament. In every drawing room from here to Scotland. She smiled. Let's see how many allies he has left when I'm done. The solicitor left looking shaken. Vivian sat alone, her hands trembling slightly now that the performance was over, and thought about what she'd just committed to. A legal battle she'd probably lose, years of scrutiny and scandal, the possibility that she'd end up with nothing. But she'd made her choice, and she would see it through. The next weeks were a blur of lawyers, depositions, and social engagements that felt more like combat than entertainment. Vivian returned to Yorkshire, to the estate that had been her prison for a decade, and began the work of securing her position. She met with tenants, reviewed contracts, ensured that everyone who depended on Ashcombe lands knew she was still the Duchess, still in control. Cedric remained in London, fighting his own battles, trying to salvage what remained of his reputation. The investigation into his financial dealings moved slowly, but the damage was done. Parliament members who'd once supported him now avoided association. His political influence evaporated, and Genevieve Carrington, along with her brother, fled England entirely. Word was they'd gone to France, where her father still lived in exile. Vivian should have felt victorious, but mostly she felt exhausted. One evening in early March, she stood in the ballroom where the masquerade had been held, the room empty now, silent. She thought about the woman she'd been that night, hearing the music box and realizing her marriage was a lie. She thought about the woman she'd become in the weeks since, harder, sharper, someone who'd burned down her life and was still standing in the ashes. She wasn't sure if she liked who she was now, but she was free, and that had to count for something. On a cold morning in late March, Vivian received word that Cedric was returning to Yorkshire. He wanted to speak with her, alone. She agreed to meet him in his study, the same room where she'd found the music box. It felt fitting. He arrived looking older, thinner, the easy confidence he'd always carried now replaced with something brittle. He sat across from her, his hands folded, his eyes avoiding hers. You've won, Vivian. I hope you're satisfied. I didn't want to win. She kept her voice steady. I wanted the truth. He laughed, bitter. The truth. You've destroyed us both for the truth. You destroyed us. I just made sure everyone knew. Silence. Outside, wind battered the windows. Finally, Cedric looked at her. What do you want? A divorce? You'll be ruined. No title, no protection. I don't want a divorce. She said it calmly, like announcing the weather. I want the estate. Full control. You can keep your title, your London life, whatever scraps of influence you have left. But Yorkshire is mine, the tenants, the land, the household. I'll manage it. You stay away. His face twisted. You think they'll accept that? A woman running... They'll accept it because the alternative is watching you run it into the ground. She leaned forward. You're finished, Cedric. Everyone knows it, but I'm just getting started. He stared at her, and for the first time in 10 years, she saw something like respect in his eyes. Maybe fear. Fine. He stood, his movements stiff. Take it. Take all of it. I'm done fighting you. He left without another word. And Vivian sat in that study, the music box still locked in a drawer somewhere, and felt the weight of what she'd just claimed. An estate. A life. A future built on the ruins of everything she'd thought she wanted. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like survival. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Vivian's life. Taking control of the estate meant more than issuing orders. It meant proving to every tenant, every servant, every neighboring lord that she could actually manage it. That she wasn't just a scorned wife playing at power, but someone who understood land, finance, and the brutal practicalities of keeping an aristocratic household running. She worked 16-hour days, reviewing accounts, meeting with stewards, negotiating contracts. She walked the fields with farmers, learned the names of their children, listened to their concerns. She renovated parts of the manor that had been neglected for years, not for vanity, but because a crumbling estate was a dying estate. And slowly, grudgingly, people began to respect her. But the isolation was crushing. Other nobles didn't know how to treat her, a duchess without her duke, a woman who'd chosen public scandal over private suffering. Invitations dried up, old friends stopped calling. She was too dangerous now, too unpredictable. The rules said she should have quietly withdrawn from society. Instead, she'd seized power. And that made her a threat. Some nights, alone in the vast manor, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. If freedom was just another word for loneliness. But then she'd walk through the estate, see the improvements she'd made, hear the tenants speak of her with something like admiration, and she'd remember. She'd survived. That was more than most women in her position could say. Spring turned to summer. The moorland bloomed, wild and harsh and beautiful. Vivian started hosting small gatherings, not the grand balls Cedric had preferred, but intimate dinners, salons where people actually talked instead of performing. She invited artists, writers, a few younger nobles who weren't afraid to associate with scandal. Slowly, the manor began to feel less like a tomb and more like something she'd chosen. One evening, during a recital she'd organized in the ballroom, a young woman approached her. Lady Margaret Hale, newly married, barely 20. "Your Grace, I wanted to thank you." Vivian smiled, confused. "For what?" "For showing us it's possible. To survive something like this." Her eyes were bright, earnest. "My husband, he's not cruel, but he's not kind either. And I used to think I just had to endure it. But after what you did," she trailed off, searching for words, "I realized enduring isn't the same as living." Vivian felt something crack open in her chest, something warm and painful. She took the girl's hand. "You're braver than you think, and you're not alone." Lady Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She squeezed Vivian's hand, then disappeared back into the crowd. And Vivian stood there, the music swelling around her, and thought, This is what it was for. Not revenge, not victory, but the chance to show other women that silence wasn't the only option. Months passed. Cedric stayed in London, a ghost in his own life. The investigation into his finances concluded with a quiet reprimand and no formal charges. Aristocrats protected their own, even when the crimes were obvious. But his reputation never recovered. He became a cautionary tale, the duke who'd gambled everything on a mistress and lost. Vivian, meanwhile, transformed the Ashcombe estate into one of the most respected holdings in Yorkshire. She invested in tenant education, modernized farming practices, supported local businesses. The estate thrived, and so did she. But the cost was real. She'd never remarry. No man would take a wife who'd publicly humiliated her first husband. She'd never have children. She'd spend the rest of her life as an outsider, admired but never fully accepted. The music box sat in a glass case in her private study, a reminder of the night she'd chosen survival over surrender. Sometimes, late at night, she'd look at it and wonder if it was worth it. If freedom was worth the loneliness, the isolation, the knowledge that she'd burned every bridge to get here. But then morning would come, and she'd walk through the estate she'd claimed, and the answer was always the same. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Yeah. It was a cool October evening when everything changed again. Vivian was in the library reviewing contracts when Mary knocked softly. "My lady, there's someone here to see you. A visitor from London." Vivian frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" Mary hesitated. "She says her name is Genevieve Carrington." The room tilted. Vivian set down her pen carefully, her hands suddenly cold. "Show her in." Mary disappeared. Vivian stood, her heart racing, and moved to the window. Outside, twilight stained the moorland purple. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth. And then the door opened, and Genevieve Carrington walked into the room. She looked different from the woman Vivian remembered at the gala. Thinner, paler, her auburn hair pulled back severely, her clothes elegant but worn. She stood in the doorway like someone who expected to be struck. "Your Grace," her voice was hoarse. "Thank you for seeing me." Vivian didn't move. "Why are you here?" Genevieve's hands twisted together. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything really, but I needed you to know the truth. Before I left England for good. The truth. Vivian laughed, sharp. I think I know enough. No. Genevieve stepped forward, her eyes fierce. You don't. Cedric told you I was his mistress, that I seduced him, that my family used him. But it wasn't like that. Vivian's jaw tightened. Then enlighten me. Genevieve took a breath. I met Cedric 5 years ago, before my father's scandal. We were in love, or I thought we were. He promised he'd marry me once he secured his position, once he didn't need his family's money anymore. She paused. Then he married you instead, for your father's connections. And I was left with nothing. Vivian felt the ground shift beneath her. That's not... It's true. Ask him. He used us both, Your Grace. You for legitimacy, me for... She faltered. For whatever it is men use women for when they can't be bothered to see us as people. The room was silent except for the fire. Vivian stared at this woman who'd been her enemy, her rival, the symbol of everything that had destroyed her marriage. And she saw something she hadn't expected. Another victim. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know that it wasn't about you. Her voice broke. You weren't lacking. You weren't inadequate. He's a man who takes what he wants and discards the rest. And I'm sorry I helped him do that to you, even if I didn't know I was. Vivian felt tears prick her eyes, hot and unexpected. She'd spent months hating this woman, imagining her as a calculating seductress who'd stolen Cedric away. But now, looking at Genevieve's hollow eyes and trembling hands, she saw the truth. They'd both been pawns in a game neither of them had chosen. What will you do now? Genevieve smiled, sad. Leave England. Start over somewhere he can't reach me. Try to build a life that's mine. Vivian nodded slowly. Then do it. And don't look back. Genevieve's eyes glistened. Thank you. She turned to leave, and Vivian called after her. Miss Carrington? Genevieve paused. You're stronger than you think. Don't let him take that from you, too. Genevieve nodded once, then disappeared into the hall. And Vivian stood alone, the weight of the conversation settling over her like ash. She'd won. She'd destroyed Cedric, claimed the estate, survived the scandal, but standing there in the firelight, she realized she'd never really understood what she was fighting. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was a system that chewed up women and spat them out, that pitted them against each other while men walked away unscathed. And she'd played right into it. The thought sat in her chest like lead. But then she remembered Lady Margaret's face at the recital, the hope in her eyes. She thought about the tenants who looked at her with respect now, the estate thriving under her care, the life she'd built from the ruins of her marriage. Maybe she hadn't won the way she'd thought, but she'd survived. And in a world built to destroy women like her, that was its own kind of victory. Winter came early that year, frost creeping across the moorland in sheets of white. Vivian spent Christmas alone in the manor, surrounded by servants but no family, no friends. Cedric didn't even send word. She sat by the fire on Christmas Eve, the music box open on the table beside her, and listened to the melody play out into the empty room. She thought about the woman she'd been at 19, hopeful and naive. The woman at 29, armored and slowly dying. The woman she was now, at 30, scarred, powerful, utterly alone. She didn't know which version she missed most. Maybe none of them. Maybe she was finally becoming someone new, someone who didn't need to be defined by what men had done to her. The music stopped. She closed the box and looked out at the snow-covered landscape, vast and merciless and hers. Tomorrow, she'd start planning the spring planting. She'd meet with the stewards, review the accounts, make decisions that would shape the estate for years to come. She'd keep building the life she'd claimed, one brutal day at a time. And somewhere in London, Cedric would wake up to a world that no longer feared or respected him, a man whose name would be a punchline for generations. But here, in this freezing manor on the edge of the world, Vivian Ashcombe would endure. And maybe, eventually, she'd even learn to live again. Winter died slowly that year, clinging to the moorland like a sickness that refused to let go. Vivian spent January locked in routines that kept her mind occupied and her hands busy. Meetings with tenant farmers who'd lost livestock to the freeze, negotiations with suppliers in York, endless paperwork that documented every shilling spent and earned. The estate demanded everything, and she gave it willingly because the alternative was sitting still long enough to feel what Genevieve's visit had opened inside her. The woman had left England 3 days after Christmas. Mary had heard it from a housemaid in London who'd heard it from a coachman. Genevieve Carrington boarded a ship to New York with nothing but 2 trunks and a one-way passage. Gone. Erased from English society as cleanly as if she'd never existed. And Vivian couldn't stop thinking about her hollow eyes, the way her voice had cracked when she'd said, "He used us both." It sat in Vivian's chest like a splinter she couldn't dig out. Because if Genevieve was telling the truth, and every instinct Vivian had screamed that she was, then the entire foundation of her rage had been built on a lie. She'd thought Cedric had chosen another woman over her, that she'd been weighed and found wanting. But he hadn't chosen anyone. He'd just taken what he wanted from whoever was convenient and moved on when they stopped serving a purpose. She wasn't even important enough to betray. She was just collateral damage. The realization should have made her angrier. Instead, it made her tired. By February, the frost finally broke. Mud replaced ice, and the estate came alive with the kind of frantic energy that always followed a hard winter. Fields needed preparing, fences needed mending, roofs needed patching before the spring rains came. Vivian threw herself into it, riding out with the steward most mornings, her boots caked in mud, her hair falling out of its pins. The tenants had stopped looking at her like she was a curiosity and started treating her like someone who actually knew what she was doing. It wasn't respect yet, but it was close. One morning in late February, she was reviewing grain contracts in the study when Mary knocked. "My lady, there's a gentleman here from London. Says he has urgent business with you." Vivian didn't look up from the ledger. "Tell him to write a letter. He says it concerns the Duke." Her pen stopped. She set it down carefully, wiped her ink-stained fingers on a cloth. "Send him in." The man who entered was middle-aged, well-dressed, but not ostentatious, carrying himself with the careful neutrality of someone who dealt in other people's disasters for a living. A solicitor, Vivian guessed, or a debt collector. "Your Grace." He bowed slightly. "Thank you for seeing me. My name is Richard Hayward. I represent several creditors in London who have concerns regarding the Duke of Ashcombe's financial situation." Vivian gestured to a chair. "Sit." "What concerns?" Hayward sat, pulling a folder from his case. Over the past 18 months, His Grace has accumulated substantial debts. Gambling, primarily. Also several investments that proved unwise. He opened the folder, revealing pages of figures. The total amount outstanding is approximately £47,000. The number hit Vivian like a fist to the stomach. She kept her face blank. "That's his problem, not mine." "Legally, Your Grace, the estate is still considered joint property. If the Duke cannot pay, and our attempts to collect have been unsuccessful, creditors may seek to claim assets tied to the Ashcombe holdings, including this property." Vivian's hands curled into fists beneath the desk. "He wouldn't. He couldn't. We have an arrangement. The estate is mine. Arrangements between spouses have no legal standing when creditors are involved." Hayward's voice was almost apologetic. "I'm here as a courtesy, Your Grace, to inform you that unless payment is made within 60 days, proceedings will begin to seize assets. That includes lands, buildings, and any liquid capital held in the Ashcombe name." The room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. Vivian forced herself to breathe slowly. "How much of the debt is secured against the estate specifically?" Hayward consulted his papers. "Approximately £18,000. The rest is personal debt, but if His Grace defaults, creditors will pursue any avenue available. And if I were to pay the secured debt myself? Then that portion would be satisfied, yes. But Your Grace, even 18,000 is not impossible." She stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I'll need a detailed breakdown of every debt tied to this estate. Names, amounts, due dates. Have it sent here by the end of the week." Hayward blinked, clearly surprised. "Of course. May I ask—" "No." She moved to the door, opened it. "Thank you for the visit, Mr. Hayward. I'll be in touch." He left, still looking uncertain. Vivian closed the door and stood there, her forehead pressed against the wood, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. £47,000. Cedric had gambled away enough money to support the estate for 3 years, and now his debts were about to swallow everything she'd fought for. The fury came then, hot and clean. Not the cold rage she'd felt at the gala, but something rawer, more desperate. She'd survived the betrayal. She'd rebuilt her life from ash, and now he was going to take it all away again, not through malice, but through sheer reckless stupidity. She walked to the window, looked out at the moorland she'd claimed as hers, the land her tenants depended on, the estate she'd poured everything into. And she thought, I will not lose this. Not to him, not to anyone. But £18,000. She had money, the allowance Cedric still paid, the income from estate improvements, savings she'd carefully hoarded, maybe $5,000 total. Nowhere near enough. And borrowing that kind of sum would require collateral she didn't have or agreements she wasn't willing to make. Unless. The thought arrived fully formed, cold and clear. She pushed it away immediately, then pulled it back, turned it over, examined it from every angle. It was risky, possibly illegal. Definitely the kind of thing that would destroy her if anyone found out. But it might work. Vivian turned from the window, sat at the desk, and began making a list. The plan took shape over the next week, like a building constructed in the dark, each piece carefully placed, tested, reinforced. Vivian worked alone, telling no one, documenting nothing that could be traced back. The first step was understanding exactly what Cedric owned beyond the estate. That meant hiring a discreet investigator in London, a man who came recommended by a tenant's son who'd gotten into trouble once and needed someone who asked no questions. Vivian paid him £50 up front and gave him a single instruction. Find everything. Properties, investments, hidden accounts, anything attached to the Ashcombe name that Cedric thought no one knew about. The report came back 10 days later. It was worse than she'd thought. Cedric didn't just have debts. He'd been systematically bleeding the family holdings dry for years, using London properties as collateral for loans he couldn't repay, signing away future income to cover present losses. The man was a financial disaster, and he'd hidden it behind titles and charm and the assumption that no one would dare question a duke. But buried in the report was something useful. A warehouse property in Southwark purchased 5 years ago and registered under a shell company Cedric had set up for reasons the investigator couldn't determine. It was small, barely worth £800, but it was unencumbered. No loans against it. No creditors with claims. Just a forgotten asset in a portfolio full of wreckage. Vivian stared at that entry for a long time. Then she wrote a letter to a merchant she'd dealt with in York, a man who'd made his fortune in textiles and had a reputation for aggressive business practices. She offered to sell him the warehouse at a steep discount, £600, cash, no questions. He agreed within 2 days. The next part was harder. Vivian needed to access the warehouse deed, which meant going to London and forging Cedric's signature on a transfer document. It was fraud. If she got caught, she'd lose everything, the estate, her position, possibly her freedom. But the alternative was watching creditors tear apart the only thing she'd ever built for herself. She left for London on a Monday morning, telling Mary she had business with solicitors. The city was gray and cold, the streets choked with March rain. Vivian went straight to the records office, wearing a mourning veil that hid most of her face, and presented documents she'd carefully prepared the night before. The clerk barely glanced at them. He processed the transfer, took the fee, handed her a receipt. 10 minutes. That's all it took to commit a crime that could hang her if the wrong person asked the right questions. She met the merchant in a tavern near the docks. He counted out £600 in banknotes, asked no questions about why a duchess was selling property in a Southwark dive, and left. Vivian sat alone in the dim tavern, the money heavy in her bag, her hands shaking slightly. She'd crossed a line, and there was no going back. Over the next month, she repeated the process 5 more times. Small properties, forgotten assets, things Cedric had acquired and ignored. A hunting lodge in Scotland, a half share in a coaching inn, a plot of land outside Manchester that had been sitting vacant for a decade. Each one she sold quietly, forging signatures, falsifying documents, moving money through channels that couldn't be easily traced. It was meticulous, exhausting work, and it was illegal as hell. But by the first week of April, she had £19,000, enough to pay off the debts secured against the estate, with £1,000 left over as a cushion. She sent payment to the creditors with a terse note stating the debts were satisfied and no further claims would be honored. Then she burned every document that could connect her to the sales, scattered the ashes in the fireplace, and waited to see if the world would explode. It didn't. The creditors accepted payment. No one questioned where the money came from. And Cedric, still in London, either didn't notice or didn't care that half a dozen properties had vanished from his portfolio. Vivian sat in her study the night the final payment cleared, staring at the ledger that showed the estate secure, and felt nothing. No triumph, no relief, just a hollow exhaustion that settled into her bones like lead. She'd saved the estate, but she'd done it by becoming exactly the kind of person she'd once despised, someone who lied, cheated, and forged documents to get what they wanted. Someone who'd convinced herself the ends justified the means. She poured herself a whiskey, drank it in one burning gulp, and told herself it didn't matter. Survival didn't care about morality, and she'd survived. That was what mattered. But late that night, alone in her bedroom, she cried for the first time since the gala. Not from sadness, from the sheer weight of what she'd become. Spring came hard and fast after that, the moorland exploding into wild green, lambs appearing in the fields, the estate humming with life. Vivian threw herself into work again, supervising planting, negotiating wool contracts, hosting small dinners that slowly rebuilt her social connections. People were starting to forget the scandal, or at least pretend to, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking on a wire stretched over a canyon, one wrong step away from plummeting. The forged documents were out there somewhere, buried but not destroyed. If anyone ever looked closely, if Cedric ever decided to audit his properties, if a creditor got suspicious, if one of the buyers talked, the entire structure would collapse. She started sleeping badly again. Waking at 3 a.m, heart pounding, convinced she'd heard footsteps in the hall. She'd check the locks twice, 3 times, pour herself whiskey to dull the edge, tell herself she was being paranoid. In May, a letter arrived from London. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in block letters. I know what you did. Vivian's hands went numb. She read it again, then a third time, looking for context, clues, anything that would tell her who'd sent it. Nothing. Just those 5 words. She burned the letter immediately, then spent the next hour pacing her study like a caged animal. Someone knew. Someone had figured it out. But who? And what did they want? The answer came 3 days later in the form of a visitor. A woman this time, middle-aged, well-dressed, with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, widow of a London merchant, and asked to speak privately. Vivian led her to the drawing room, her pulse hammering. Mrs. Pritchard sat, arranged her skirts, and got straight to the point. Your Grace, I represent a group of investors interested in acquiring certain properties in Southwark. During our research, we discovered some irregularities regarding a warehouse that was recently sold. Specifically, the signature on the transfer documents appears to have been forged. Vivian's face went cold. I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Pritchard smiled. Of course not. Which is why I'm here to offer a solution. We have no interest in creating a scandal. In fact, we'd prefer to keep this matter entirely private, but we do require compensation for our discretion. Blackmail. The word hung between them like smoke. Vivian kept her voice steady. How much? £5,000. The amount was absurd, designed to be impossible. Vivian almost laughed. I don't have that kind of money. Then perhaps you could arrange to sell additional properties. Mrs. Pritchard's voice was pleasant, reasonable. We'd be happy to assist with the transactions. For a fee, of course. And if I refuse, then I'm afraid we'd have no choice but to report the forgery to the authorities. The legal consequences would be severe. She paused. Not to mention the scandal. I imagine the newspapers would find it quite fascinating that the Duchess who exposed her husband's betrayal is herself a criminal. Vivian's nails dug into her palms. She wanted to throw this woman out, call the constable, deny everything. But the proof was real. She'd signed those documents. And if this woman had copies, if she'd done her research, then Vivian was trapped. I need time. Mrs. Pritchard stood, smoothing her gloves. Of course. Let's say 2 weeks. I'll return then for your answer. She moved to the door, then paused. Oh, and your grace? Don't consider running. We're watching. It would be unfortunate if you forced us to accelerate our timeline. She left. Vivian sat alone in the drawing room, her mind racing. 5,000 pounds. She'd just spent 19,000 saving the estate. She had maybe 1,000 in liquid funds. No way to raise that kind of money without selling estate assets, which would raise questions she couldn't answer. She was trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow looked like someone watching. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She couldn't pay the blackmail. She couldn't run, which left only one option. She had to go to Cedric. The thought made her physically ill, but she couldn't see another way out. If she confessed everything to him, the forgeries, the blackmail, the entire desperate scheme, maybe he'd help. Not out of love or loyalty, but out of self-preservation. Because if she went down, the scandal would destroy what little remained of his reputation. They were tied together, whether either of them liked it or not. She wrote to him requesting a meeting, urgent, private. He responded 2 days later with a terse note. London, Saturday, my club. She took the train south, feeling like she was traveling to her own execution. The city was blooming with early summer, parks full of families, the Thames glittering in sunlight. It all felt like a cruel joke, the world going on while hers imploded. Cedric's club was one of those ancient establishments that reeked of cigars and old money. Women weren't allowed inside, so they met in a private room off the main entrance. He was waiting when she arrived, looking thinner than she remembered, his face lined with exhaustion. Vivian. He didn't stand. What's so urgent it couldn't wait? She sat across from him, her back straight. I need your help. He laughed, bitter. That's rich. You destroy my reputation, take my estate, and now you want help? I saved the estate. From your debts. She leaned forward. Debts you accumulated gambling away 47,000 pounds like an idiot. His face darkened. How did you? I paid them. The debt secured against the property. 18,000 pounds. She watched his expression shift from anger to confusion to something like fear. You're welcome, by the way. Where did you get that kind of money? She told him. All of it. The properties she'd sold, the forged signatures, the investigator, the blackmail letter, Mrs. Pritchard's visit. Every illegal, desperate thing she'd done to keep creditors from tearing apart the only thing she had left. By the time she finished, Cedric was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. You forged my signature. Multiple times. Yes. You committed fraud. Sold properties that weren't yours to sell. Technically, they were yours, which means they were partially mine, and you were too drunk or distracted to notice. She kept her voice flat. Are you going to help me or not? He stood, walked to the window, stared out at the street. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, why should I? Because if I go down, you go down with me. The scandal won't just touch me. It'll obliterate you. The Duke whose wife turned criminal to save his estate from his own stupidity. How do you think that plays in Parliament? He turned, his eyes hard. You could have come to me, asked for help. Would you have given it? Silence. They both knew the answer. Finally, Cedric sighed. What do you need? The blackmail paid, 5,000 pounds, and I need you to handle it. Make it look like a business transaction, something that can't be traced back to me. And if I do this, then we're even. I'll stop interfering with your life. You stop interfering with mine. We live separately, quietly, and pretend this marriage was never a mistake. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Fine, I'll handle it. But Vivian, this is the last time. Don't come to me again. Trust me, she said, standing. I won't. She left before he could say anything else. Outside, the London streets were crowded and loud, the city indifferent to her crisis. She hailed a cab, gave the driver directions to the train station, and sat in the rattling carriage thinking about how much she hated herself. She'd gone to Cedric for help, the man who'd betrayed her, humiliated her, nearly destroyed everything she'd built. And now she owed him. Again. But she didn't have a choice. That was the thing survival had taught her. Sometimes there were no good options, just bad ones and worse ones, and you picked whichever let you keep breathing. It comes. Cedric paid the blackmail. She didn't know how, didn't ask. A week after their meeting, she received a terse note. It's handled. Don't contact me again. Mrs. Pritchard never returned. The letter stopped. And Vivian went back to Yorkshire, back to the estate, back to the routines that kept her sane. But something had shifted. She couldn't pretend anymore that she was the wronged party, the virtuous wife who'd been betrayed and come out stronger. She'd crossed lines she'd never thought she'd cross. She'd committed crimes. She'd blackmailed her husband by threatening mutual destruction. She'd become exactly the kind of person she'd once despised, ruthless, calculating, willing to do whatever it took to survive. And the worst part? She didn't regret it, not really, because the alternative was losing everything, and she refused to lose. By June, the estate was thriving. The wool harvest was strong, tenant relations were solid, and Vivian had quietly paid off the remaining personal debt she could track down without alerting creditors. On paper, everything looked fine, but she felt like she was rotting from the inside. She started drinking more. Not publicly. She was too careful for that. But alone in her study at night, a bottle of whiskey and a glass, sitting in the dark and trying not to think about what she'd become. The music box sat on a shelf across the room, the glass case dusty now. She hadn't opened it in months. Couldn't stand to hear the melody anymore. One night in late June, she got drunk enough to pull it down, smash the glass case on the floor, and throw the music box into the fireplace. It didn't burn. The metal just blackened, the mechanism inside making a grinding sound as it melted. But it felt good, like destroying the last piece of the woman she'd been before everything went to hell. Mary found her the next morning, passed out in the chair, the ruined music box still smoking in the cold fireplace. The girl didn't say anything, just helped Vivian to bed, cleaned up the glass, and never mentioned it again. That was the bottom. Or at least Vivian told herself it was, because if it got worse than this, she didn't think she'd survive it. Thus, July brought a reprieve, a letter from Lady Margaret Hale, inviting Vivian to a small gathering at her estate in Somerset. Nothing grand, just a few women, conversation, a chance to step away from Yorkshire and the suffocating weight of everything that had happened. Vivian almost declined, but then she thought about sitting alone in the manor for another month, drinking herself numb, and she accepted. The gathering was exactly what Margaret had promised, small, intimate, no men, no pressure to perform. A half-dozen women, most of them young, sitting in a garden drinking lemonade and talking about things that didn't matter. Books, fashion, gossip. It should have been boring. Instead, it was the first time Vivian had felt human in months. On the second evening, Margaret pulled her aside. "How are you, really?" Vivian smiled, the expression automatic. "Fine. Busy with the estate, but—" "No." Margaret's eyes were serious. "How are you?" The question cracked something open. Vivian looked away, her throat tight. "I'm tired, Margaret. I'm so tired." Margaret took her hand. "You don't have to be strong all the time." "Yes, I do, because if she stopped being strong, even for a moment, she'd fall apart. And there was no one to catch her." They sat in silence for a while, the garden around them soft with twilight. Finally, Margaret said, "You know, when you exposed Cedric at the gala, I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever met. But now I think you're just the loneliest." Vivian's eyes burned. Maybe both. Margaret squeezed her hand. "Then stop pushing everyone away. Let people help you. Let them see that you're human." "I can't." The words came out raw. "If they see me weak, they'll destroy me, or they'll love you for it." Margaret smiled. "Not everyone's your enemy, Vivian." The words stayed with her long after the gathering ended. "Not everyone's your enemy." It was a nice thought, but Vivian had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Every time she'd let someone in, Cedric, her family, even herself, it had ended in betrayal or pain. Better to stay armored, better to keep everyone at a distance. But God, she was lonely, bad. She returned to Yorkshire in early August, the moorland scorched gold by summer heat. The estate felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in. Or maybe she was just finally seeing it for what it was, a beautiful cage she'd fought to claim and now couldn't escape. That night she sat in her study and wrote 2 letters. The first was to Cedric, formally requesting a legal separation. Not a divorce that would require an act of parliament and public scandal neither of them could afford, but a separation, a formal acknowledgement that their marriage was over in everything but name. The second letter was to herself. A list of everything she'd done, the forgeries, the blackmail, the lies, the crimes. A confession. She sealed it, addressed it to no one, and locked it in a drawer. Insurance, maybe. Or a memorial for the woman she used to be. Then she poured herself a whiskey, sat by the window, and watched the sun set over the moorland. Tomorrow, she'd send the letter to Cedric. Tomorrow, she'd start figuring out how to live with what she'd become. But tonight, she just sat in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of it. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the knowledge that she'd survived, but only by becoming someone she barely recognized. Somewhere in London, Cedric would receive her letter and probably feel relief. Somewhere in New York, Genevieve was building a life free from men who used her. Somewhere, women like Lady Margaret were learning they didn't have to endure in silence. But here, in this cold manor on the edge of the world, Vivian Ashcombe sat alone with her whiskey and her crimes and the ruins of everything she'd once believed about survival. And she wondered, not for the first time, if freedom was just another word for isolation, if fighting back had saved her or destroyed her, if she'd won anything at all, or just traded one kind of prison for another. The whiskey burned going down. Outside, the moorland stretched into darkness, and Vivian Ashcombe, Duchess of nothing that mattered anymore, sat alone and waited for morning. Because morning always came, and she always survived it. That was the problem. She always survived. The response from Cedric came 10 days later. A single page, his handwriting messier than she remembered. Agreed. I'll have my solicitor draft the papers. We're done. She read it 3 times, looking for anger or grief or regret. Found nothing. Just exhaustion that matched her own. They'd destroyed each other so thoroughly there was nothing left to say. She filed the letter away and went back to work. Because that's what she did. She survived. She worked. She pretended the hollowness inside her was just temporary, just something that would fade with time. But late at night, alone in the dark, she knew the truth. The hollowness wasn't temporary. It was who she was now, and there was no going back from that. The separation papers arrived in September with the first autumn storms, rain hammering the windows like something trying to get in. Vivian signed them in her study without ceremony, her signature a quick slash of ink that felt more like erasure than resolution. 10 years of marriage reduced to legal language and 3 witness signatures. The solicitor who delivered them, a nervous young man from York, took the papers and left quickly, as if afraid the Duchess might change her mind or worse, ask him to stay for tea. She didn't. She sat alone after he'd gone, listening to the rain, and felt nothing. No relief, no sadness. Just the same hollow exhaustion that had become her constant companion. The estate was secure. The debts were paid. Cedric was out of her life. By every measure, she'd won. So why did it feel like losing? Mary knocked softly, entering with the afternoon post. Your Grace, these just arrived. Special courier from London. Vivian took the letters. 3 of them, all sealed with wax she didn't recognize. She opened the first and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Your Grace, it has come to our attention that certain property transfers executed in your name may require further examination. We request your presence in London at your earliest convenience to discuss these matters. Failure to respond will result in formal proceedings. Sincerely, Whitmore and Associates, Solicitors. Her hands went cold. She opened the second letter. Different firm, same message. The third was from a magistrate's office, requesting documentation regarding the sale of properties in Southwark, Manchester, and Scotland between March and May of the current year. They knew. Somehow, despite Cedric paying the blackmail, despite Mrs. Pritchard disappearing, despite every precaution she'd taken, they knew. Vivian set the letters down carefully, her mind racing. This wasn't blackmail. This was official. Legal inquiries from multiple sources. Coordinated, deliberate. Someone had gone to the authorities. Someone wanted her destroyed. Mary was still standing in the doorway, her face worried. My lady, is everything... I need you to pack a bag. We're leaving for London in the morning. But the weather... I don't care about the weather. She stood, already moving toward the door. And Mary, don't tell anyone where we're going. The girl nodded, disappearing quickly. Vivian stood alone in the study, the rain beating against the windows, and tried to think through the panic clawing at her throat. Someone had reported her, but who? Cedric wouldn't. He'd paid the blackmail specifically to avoid this kind of exposure. Mrs. Pritchard had gotten her money and vanished. The buyers she'd dealt with had no reason to talk, unless one of them had been caught in some other scheme and traded information to save themselves. Or unless... The thought hit her like a fist. Unless there was never any blackmail. Unless Mrs. Pritchard had been gathering evidence the whole time, building a case, waiting for the right moment to strike. Unless this had been planned from the beginning. Vivian's stomach turned. She'd been so focused on survival, on putting out fires, that she hadn't seen the larger trap closing around her. And now she was caught, completely and utterly caught, with no way out except straight through. She spent the night burning documents. Anything that could tie her to the forgeries, the sales, the illegal transactions. Letters, receipts, notes she'd made during her investigation. All of it went into the fireplace, page by page, until her study reeked of smoke and her hands were black with ash. It probably wouldn't matter. If the authorities had documentation, and they must to be this confident, then destroying her own copies was just theater. But she did it anyway because doing nothing felt like surrender. By dawn, the rain had stopped. Vivian and Mary took the early train to London, the countryside rolling past in shades of gray and brown. Vivian didn't sleep. She sat rigid in her seat, going over every transaction, every forged signature, every lie she'd told, looking for the weakness, the mistake that had brought this down on her. She still couldn't find it. Tuts. London was colder than Yorkshire, the city wrapped in early autumn fog that made everything look diseased. Vivian went straight to the offices of Whitmore and Associates, a shabby building near the courts that smelled of old paper and desperation. The clerk who greeted her was young, officious, clearly enjoying his small power. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitmore." She kept her voice level. "Regarding the letter I received, do you have an appointment?" "No, but I'm sure he'll make time." The clerk smirked. "I'm sure he won't. Mr. Whitmore is very busy. Tell him the Duchess of Ashcombe is here. And if he doesn't see me in the next 5 minutes, I'll stand in this lobby and explain very loudly why his firm is harassing a peer of the realm." The smirk vanished. He disappeared into a back office. 2 minutes later, Vivian was being ushered into a cramped room where a middle-aged man with thinning hair and sharp eyes sat behind a desk piled with files. "Your Grace." He didn't stand. "Thank you for coming. Let's skip the pleasantries." She sat without being invited. "What is this about?" Whitmore opened a file, pulled out a document. "Over the past several months, our firm has been retained to investigate irregularities in property transfers associated with the Ashcombe holdings. Specifically, we've identified 6 properties sold between March and May of this year using forged authorization documents." He slid a paper across the desk. Vivian recognized it immediately. The transfer deed for the Southwark warehouse, her careful forgery of Cedric's signature right there in black ink. "We've examined the signatures," Whitmore continued. "They don't match authenticated examples of the Duke's hand. They do, however, match documents we've obtained that were signed by you." Vivian kept her face blank. "Who retained you?" "That's confidential. Convenient." She leaned back. "Are you accusing me of a crime, mister?" "Whitmore, I'm informing you that evidence suggests you may have committed fraud. Multiple counts." His voice was pleasant, almost friendly. "We're prepared to present this evidence to a magistrate unless you'd like to offer an explanation. And if I told you these properties were sold with my husband's full knowledge and consent, then we'd ask why he filed a formal complaint 3 days ago claiming he had no knowledge of any sales." The room went silent. Vivian's pulse hammered in her ears. Cedric filed a complaint. Cedric, who'd agreed to help her, who'd paid the blackmail, who'd signed separation papers acknowledging their arrangement. Cedric had gone to the authorities and claimed she'd acted without his knowledge. He'd turned on her, completely, deliberately, and she'd never seen it coming. Whitmore was watching her carefully. "Your Grace, fraud against one's spouse is still fraud. And given the amounts involved, how much does he want?" "Excuse me? How much does my husband want to make this go away?" She kept her voice flat. Because this isn't about justice, Mr. Whitmore. This is leverage. So let's stop pretending and name the price. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. The Duke has expressed a willingness to withdraw his complaint if certain conditions are met. And those are? You relinquish all claim to the Ashcombe estate, sign over full control, remove yourself from any management role, and relocate permanently. Additionally, you agree never to publicly discuss the circumstances of your separation or any financial matters related to the Duke. Vivian felt the walls closing in. He wanted everything. The estate she'd saved, the life she'd built, her silence about his debts and gambling and every reckless thing he'd done. And if she refused, he'd have her arrested for fraud, tried in court, probably convicted. She'd lose everything anyway, but publicly, humiliatingly, with her name dragged through every newspaper in England. He'd trapped her perfectly. I need time to consider. You have 48 hours. After that, we file with the magistrate. She stood, her legs unsteady. I'll be in touch. She walked out of the office, through the dingy lobby, into the London street where fog pressed against her face like wet cloth. Her mind was blank, white noise roaring in her ears. She couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. Cedric had betrayed her, after she'd saved his estate, after she'd paid his debts, after she'd come to him desperate and he'd agreed to help. He'd taken her confession and weaponized it, turned her crimes into leverage to steal back everything she'd claimed. And the worst part, the part that made her want to vomit in the gutter, was that she'd given him the ammunition. She told him everything, every detail of what she'd done, every forged signature, every illegal transaction. She'd trusted him because she'd been desperate and stupid and too tired to see the trap. She'd handed him the knife, and he'd driven it straight into her back. Vivian spent the rest of that day walking London streets in a daze. She didn't go back to the rooms she'd rented, didn't eat, just walked, the city a blur around her, her mind caught in an endless loop of rage and disbelief and something close to grief. Not for Cedric, she'd stopped loving him years ago, but for herself. For the woman she'd been before all this started, the one who'd believed fighting back meant something. That survival was worth the cost. That woman was gone, burned away by desperation and crime, and the bitter lesson that power didn't care about justice. It cared about who had leverage and who didn't. And right now, Cedric held all the cards. By evening, she found herself outside his London residence, a townhouse in Mayfair, elegant and expensive, bought with money she'd helped save. Lights glowed in the windows. She could see movement inside. Servants, probably, preparing dinner for a man who'd just destroyed her life with the same casual ease he'd once shown ordering wine. She should leave. Should go back to her rooms, figure out her next move, find some angle she'd missed. But instead, she walked up to the door and knocked. The butler who answered recognized her, his face going carefully neutral. Your Grace. I'm afraid His Grace is not receiving. Tell him I'm here. She pushed past him into the foyer. Tell him now. The butler hesitated, then disappeared up the stairs. Vivian stood in the entrance hall, her heart pounding, her hands clenched into fists. A moment later, footsteps. Cedric appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at her with an expression that might have been regret or might have been satisfaction. Hard to tell in the lamplight. Vivian, I didn't expect... You son of a bitch. Her voice cut through whatever pleasantry he'd been about to offer. You filed a complaint. After everything. After I saved your worthless estate from your debts. After I came to you for help and you agreed. You turned on me. He descended the stairs slowly, his face calm. I protected myself, that's all. You betrayed me. No. He stopped a few steps from the bottom, looking down at her. I finally stopped letting you control the narrative. You've spent months playing the victim, Vivian, the wronged wife, the noble Duchess. But you're a criminal. You forged my signature. You stole my property. And you expected me to just accept it because you were too proud to ask for help properly. I asked for help. I came to you desperate, and you agreed to pay the blackmail. I paid it to buy time, to gather evidence, to build a case that would finally free me from this disaster of a marriage. He came down the last steps, standing close enough that she could see the cold calculation in his eyes. You think you're the only one who's been trapped? I've spent 10 years married to a woman who looked at me like I was something she scraped off her shoe, who blamed me for every disappointment in her miserable life. And when you finally had a chance to leave quietly, to take a settlement and disappear, you chose to humiliate me instead. Because you deserved it. Maybe. He smiled, thin and joyless. But now you're the one facing consequences. And I'm offering you a way out. Sign over the estate. Leave. Start over somewhere else. Or don't, and spend the next 5 years in court, and possibly prison. Your choice. She wanted to hit him, wanted to scream, wanted to tear this house apart brick by brick until there was nothing left. Instead, she said, "You'll destroy the estate. Without me managing it, you'll bleed it dry within 2 years. Probably. But it'll be mine to destroy." He turned, heading back up the stairs. "You have 48 hours, Vivian. Choose wisely." He disappeared. Vivian stood alone in the foyer, the butler hovering nearby, clearly uncomfortable. She left without another word, walking out into the London night, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. He'd won, completely, utterly, and there was nothing she could do about it. What? She didn't sleep that night. Sat in her rented room staring at the wall, going over every option, every possible angle. She could refuse to sign, let Cedric file charges, go to trial. But even if she somehow avoided prison, the scandal would destroy her. No one would ever trust her again. She'd be the Duchess who committed fraud against her own husband. Toxic, unemployable, alone. She could run. Leave England entirely, start over in America or France or somewhere Cedric's reach didn't extend. But that meant abandoning everything. The estate, the tenants who depended on her, the small network of women like Lady Margaret who'd started to see her as proof that fighting back was possible. It meant admitting Cedric had won and she'd lost, and there was no coming back. Or she could sign. Give him what he wanted. Walk away with nothing and spend the rest of her life somewhere quiet and forgotten. A cautionary tale about women who reached too far. None of the options were good, but running felt like dying slowly. And refusing to sign felt like dying fast, which left signing and walking away as the only choice that let her survive with any dignity intact. She hated it, hated him, hated herself for getting into this position. But by dawn, she'd made her decision. She'd sign. Well, the next morning, she went back to Whitmore's office. The clerk looked smug when he saw her, clearly expecting capitulation. She ignored him, walking straight into Whitmore's office without knocking. "I'll sign." Her voice was flat. "On one condition." Whitmore leaned back in his chair. "And that is?" "The Duke provides a written statement acknowledging that the properties I sold were his, not mine, and that he gave verbal consent for the transactions at the time. It doesn't have to admit he knew I'd forge his signature, just that he knew the properties were being liquidated and chose not to object. That contradicts his complaint." "I don't care. Either he provides the statement or I refuse to sign and we both go down in flames." She leaned forward. "Because if I'm facing trial, Mr. Whitmore, I'll make sure every newspaper in England knows exactly why I committed fraud. The gambling debts, the mistress, the fact that I saved his estate with money from those sales. It'll destroy both of us, but at least I'll have company." Whitmore studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll relay your condition. Do that. And tell the Duke he has 24 hours. After that, I start talking." She left before he could respond. Spent the rest of the day in her rooms, pacing, second-guessing, wondering if she'd just made another catastrophic mistake. But by evening, a messenger arrived with a document, a single-page statement signed by Cedric acknowledging verbal consent for property liquidation. It was vague, carefully worded, but it was enough. Proof that she hadn't acted entirely without his knowledge. Not enough to save her reputation, but enough to keep her out of prison. She signed the separation agreement that night, relinquished all claim to the Ashcombe estate, agreed to relocate and never publicly discuss the circumstances of her marriage, and took the only thing she could, a letter from Cedric that might someday keep her from being prosecuted. The next morning she left London, didn't say goodbye to anyone, just took Mary and a single trunk of belongings and boarded a train north. Not to Yorkshire, she was forbidden from returning there, but to a small town on the coast where no one knew her and no one cared about scandals in London. She rented a cottage overlooking the sea, unpacked her few possessions, stood at the window watching waves crash against rocks and thought about everything she'd lost. The estate, the power, the illusion that fighting back meant anything. She'd exposed Cedric's betrayal, survived blackmail, committed fraud to save what she'd built, and in the end, he'd taken it all back with a single complaint to the authorities. Because that's how power worked. The rules applied to people like her, but not to men like him. And thinking she could change that had been the biggest delusion of all. The first month in the cottage was the worst. Vivian had no purpose, no routine, nothing to fill the hours except memories and regret. She'd wake at dawn out of habit, ready to review accounts and meet with tenants, and then remember she had no accounts, no tenants, no estate, just an empty cottage and a life that felt like punishment. Mary stayed with her, loyal despite everything. But even Mary's presence couldn't fill the void. The girl tried to engage her, suggested walks along the coast, trips into town, anything to get the Duchess out of the cottage. Vivian refused. What was the point? She had nothing, was nothing, just a woman who'd gambled everything on survival and lost. Letters arrived occasionally, one from Lady Margaret, expressing concern and asking where Vivian had gone. Another from a tenant at the Yorkshire estate, thanking her for everything she'd done and wishing her well. Vivian burned them all. She didn't deserve their kindness, didn't deserve anything except the isolation she'd earned. By October, the weather turned brutal. Storms rolling in off the sea, waves slamming against the cliffs, wind tearing at the cottage roof. Vivian spent hours standing at the window, watching the water, thinking how easy it would be to walk down to the rocks and let the ocean finish what Cedric had started. She never did. Not out of courage or hope, but out of spite. Because if she died now, he'd have won completely. And she refused to give him that satisfaction. But God, she was tired. The letter arrived in late October, unexpected and devastating. Not from Cedric or the solicitors, but from Mary's sister in Yorkshire. The housekeeper had found it while sorting mail and sent it on, assuming Vivian would want to know. Your Grace, I write with heavy heart to inform you of events at the estate. Since your departure, the Duke has dismissed half the staff and ceased all improvement projects. Tenant rents have been raised significantly, and several families have been evicted for inability to pay. The Duke claims modernization is no longer necessary. Many of us fear what will become of the estate under his management. We thought you should know. Your servant, Mrs. Davies. Vivian read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. Cedric was destroying everything she'd built. All the improvements, the relationships with tenants, the careful management that had made the estate thrive. He was tearing it apart, either out of incompetence or malice or both. The people who'd trusted her, who'd come to respect her, were being punished for her failures. And there was nothing she could do. She'd signed away her rights, agreed never to interfere, taken Cedric's letter acknowledging consent, and walked away. If she tried to fight this, he'd accuse her of violating their agreement and have her arrested for fraud. The trap was perfect, inescapable. She sat at the cottage table for hours, the letter in front of her, thinking about the tenants being evicted. Families she'd helped, children she'd met, people who'd believed she'd protect them, and she'd abandoned them, saved herself and left them to Cedric's mercy. The guilt was worse than anything she'd felt before, worse than the betrayal, worse than the humiliation. Because this wasn't about her anymore. This was about people who'd trusted her and paid the price for her survival. Mary found her that evening, still sitting at the table, the letter clutched in her hand. My lady, you need to eat something. I destroyed them. Vivian's voice was hollow. I saved the estate from creditors and handed it to a man who's using it as a weapon. They're suffering because of me. You couldn't have known. I should have. She looked up, her eyes burning. I should have fought harder, refused to sign, gone to trial. Anything except walking away. You would have lost everything. I lost everything anyway. At least if I'd fought, they'd still have a chance. Mary knelt beside her chair. My lady, it's not over. You still have the Duke's letter. You have proof he knew about the sales. That's leverage. Leverage to do what? Go back? He'll have me arrested the moment I set foot in Yorkshire. Then don't go back. Mary's voice was urgent. But do something. Write to Parliament. Contact the newspapers. Expose what he's doing to the tenants. Let the world see what kind of man he is. and violate the separation agreement. Vivian shook her head. He'll destroy me. He's already destroying them. Mary stood. So you have to decide, Your Grace. Do you want to survive quietly while people suffer? Or do you want to fight even if it costs you everything? The question hung in the air between them. Vivian looked at the letter, at Mary's fierce eyes, at the window where darkness pressed against the glass. She thought about the tenants being evicted, about the estate being gutted, about Cedric winning while everyone else paid the price. She thought about the woman she'd been at the gala, standing in front of London's elite with a music box in her hand, refusing to be silent. And she thought about the woman she'd become, bitter, defeated, too tired to keep fighting. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe it wasn't over. Maybe there was still one move left, one final gamble that could either save the people she'd abandoned or destroy her completely. But to make it, she'd have to become someone new, someone who didn't care about survival or reputation or safety, someone willing to burn everything down if that's what justice required. She looked at Mary. If I do this, I'll lose. He'll have me arrested. I'll probably go to prison. Probably. And it won't even matter. The estate will still be his. The tenants will still suffer. I'll just be another cautionary tale about women who didn't know when to quit. Maybe. Mary's voice was soft. Or maybe you'll be the woman who fought back even when it was hopeless. And maybe that means something. Vivian stood, walked to the window, stared out at the black sea. She was so tired of fighting, so tired of losing, so tired of being the person who sacrificed everything and gained nothing. But she was also tired of being afraid. She turned from the window. Get me paper and ink. I'm writing to every newspaper in London, and then I'm going to Yorkshire. My lady, he'll... I know. She smiled, sharp and joyless. But if I'm going down, I'm taking him with me. Hukak. She spent the next 3 days writing. Letters to newspapers detailing Cedric's evictions, his debt, his betrayal of the people who depended on him. Letters to members of parliament she'd met over the years, asking them to investigate conditions at the estate. Letters to neighboring lords explaining what was happening and asking for their intervention. Every letter included copies of the statement Cedric had signed acknowledging the property sales, proof that he'd known what she was doing and only turned on her when it suited him. It was a scorched earth strategy. If the letters worked, they'd expose Cedric as the reckless, vindictive bastard he was. But they'd also violate her separation agreement and give him grounds to prosecute her for fraud. She'd be arrested, tried, probably convicted. Everything she'd done to survive would be for nothing. But the alternative was living the rest of her life knowing she'd chosen herself over people who'd trusted her. And she couldn't do that. Not anymore. On the 4th day, she mailed the letters. All of them. Then she packed a bag, told Mary she was going to Yorkshire, and caught the morning train south. Mary had begged her not to go. Had pointed out that showing her face at the estate was suicide. That Cedric would have her arrested the moment she arrived. Vivian knew all of it. Went anyway. Because if she was going to destroy herself, she wanted to do it on the land she'd fought for. Wanted to look Cedric in the eye one last time and make sure he knew she wasn't going quietly. The train ride took most of the day. Vivian sat in the third-class carriage, watching the countryside roll past, and thought about the girl she'd been at 19, the bride who'd believed marriage was salvation. She wondered what that girl would think of the woman she'd become. A forger, a blackmailer, a criminal who'd committed fraud and was now deliberately courting arrest because she was too stubborn or too broken to stop fighting. Probably nothing good. But that girl was dead. Had been for years. And whoever Vivian was now, whatever damaged, reckless thing she'd become, was the only version left. And that version wasn't going to spend the rest of her life hiding in a cottage while people suffered in her name. She arrived at the estate just after dark, the manor lit up like something out of a nightmare. Carriages lined the drive, music drifted from open windows. Cedric was hosting a party. Of course he was. Celebrating his victory, probably. Showing off the estate he'd reclaimed. Vivian walked up the drive, her bag heavy in her hand, her heart pounding. She didn't have a plan. Hadn't thought beyond getting here. But she knocked on the door anyway, and when the butler opened it, Mr. Graves, who'd served the estate for 30 years, his face went white. Your Grace. He glanced over his shoulder, clearly panicking. You shouldn't be here. The Duke specifically, I know what the Duke said. She pushed past him into the foyer. Where is he? The ballroom. But, Your Grace, please, if he sees you, he's going to see me. That's the point. She walked through the house she'd once called home, past servants who stared in shock toward the sound of music and laughter. The ballroom doors were open. Inside, maybe 50 people, lords and ladies from neighboring estates, London socialites, Cedric's remaining allies. They were drinking champagne, dancing, completely oblivious to the evicted families and gutted tenancies and ruined lives their host had left in his wake. Vivian stood in the doorway, still wearing her travel-stained dress, her hair unpinned, looking like something that had crawled out of the moorland. The music stopped. Conversations died. Everyone turned to stare. And across the room, near the far wall, Cedric froze mid-sentence, a champagne glass in his hand, his face going from shock to rage in the space of a heartbeat. Vivian walked into the ballroom. 50 pairs of eyes followed her. The silence was absolute. Cedric recovered first, setting down his glass and crossing the room with forced calm. Vivian, what a surprise. I wasn't expecting... I'm sure you weren't. Her voice carried across the ballroom. But I thought I should attend. Since this is technically still my home. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Actually, as per our agreement, you relinquished all claim to the property. Yes, but not to the truth. She turned, addressing the room. How many of you know what's happening here? The evictions? The families thrown out because they can't afford the rents your host doubled the moment I left? Vivian, you're violating... I'm exposing. She pulled a folded paper from her bag, a copy of the letter from Mrs. Davies. 3 families evicted in the past month. A dozen more facing the same. All the improvements I made stripped for quick profit. And you're all standing here drinking champagne while people who've worked this land for generations are thrown out into the cold. You're insane. Cedric's voice was low, dangerous. You need to leave. Now. Or what? You'll have me arrested? She laughed, sharp and bitter. Go ahead, call the constable. Drag me out in front of all your guests. Let them watch you silence the woman who saved this estate from your debts. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She could see people exchanging glances, confusion spreading. They didn't know the full story. Probably only knew what Cedric had told them, that his wife had committed fraud and been banished. But now she was here, throwing accusations, creating doubt. Cedric grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. You're done. He started pulling her toward the door. Guards, remove her. 2 men moved forward, but Vivian wrenched free. I have letters, she shouted, proof that he knew about every property sale, that he gave consent, that he only turned on me when I stopped being useful. She pulled out another paper, Cedric's statement acknowledging the sales. This is his signature, his admission. And every newspaper in London received a copy this morning. The room exploded. People talking over each other, lords demanding to know what was going on, ladies whispering behind fans. And Cedric's face, God, his face, twisted into something ugly and desperate and furious. You stupid bitch! He lunged at her, and for a moment Vivian thought he might actually hit her in front of everyone. But he stopped himself, his hands clenched into fists. You've destroyed us both. No. She met his eyes, unflinching. I destroyed you. I'm already gone. And she walked out of the ballroom through the house, out the front door into the cold night. Behind her, chaos. Raised voices, the sound of the party collapsing. She didn't look back, just kept walking, down the drive, toward the road, toward whatever came next. She'd done it, burned every bridge, violated the agreement, exposed Cedric in front of witnesses who couldn't ignore it. The letters would reach London tomorrow. By the end of the week, the scandal would be everywhere. And Cedric, pompous, reckless, vindictive Cedric, would be ruined. But so would she. He'd file charges, she'd be arrested within days, tried for fraud, probably convicted. Everything she'd done, every crime she'd committed to survive, would come out. And this time there'd be no deal, no escape, just consequences. She reached the road and stopped, breathing hard, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline and something that might have been relief. The moorland stretched around her, dark and endless. Behind her, the manor glowed like a dying star. Ahead, nothing but uncertainty and probable ruin. She'd lost. Completely. Irreversibly. But she'd made sure Cedric lost too. And somehow, standing there in the cold with nowhere to go and nothing left, that felt like enough. The sound of hoofbeats. She turned, expecting guards or constables. Instead, a single rider, Mary, on one of the estate horses, leading a second mount. Thought you might need a way out. Mary's voice was steady. There's a coach waiting 3 miles north. It'll take you to the coast. A ship leaves for France tomorrow morning. Vivian stared at her. You planned this. Someone had to. Mary dismounted, handing Vivian the reins. You made your stand. Now run before they catch you. And if they come after me, then you'll deal with it in France. Mary's eyes were fierce. But you don't have to die here. Not tonight. Vivian looked back at the manor one last time. Thought about staying, facing arrest, accepting whatever punishment came. But then she thought about the tenants who'd get no justice if she was locked in prison. About the possibility, however slim, that her letters might actually change something if she wasn't there to be used as a distraction. About the woman she'd been at the gala, refusing to be silent. And the woman she'd become in this godforsaken ballroom tonight, refusing to survive quietly while others suffered. She took the reins, mounted the horse. When they come for me, tell them I went north. I'll tell them nothing. Mary smiled. Now ride. Vivian kicked the horse into a gallop, racing across the moorland toward a road she couldn't see, toward a future that might mean exile or prison or death. The wind tore at her hair, the ground blurred beneath her, and behind her the estate she'd fought for and lost glowed one last time before disappearing into darkness. She didn't know what came next. Didn't know if she'd make the coast, if the letters would matter, if anything she'd done tonight would change a single damn thing. But she'd fought back, even when it was hopeless, even when it meant losing everything. And in the cold, dark, rushing past, Vivian Ashcombe finally understood. Survival wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to let them break you, even if breaking was all you had left. She rode into the night, toward France or prison or whatever hell waited. And she didn't look back. The horse stumbled twice before they reached the coach, its breath coming in ragged bursts that matched Vivian's own. 3 miles felt like 30. The moorland a black void that could have hidden anything. Constables, Cedric's men, the edge of the world. Mary rode beside her in silence, both of them bent low against the wind that tore across the open ground like something alive and hunting. The coach was waiting exactly where Mary had promised, a battered thing with no markings and a driver who didn't ask questions. Vivian dismounted, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. Mary caught her arm. The ship leaves at dawn. The driver knows where to take you. Come with me. Vivian's voice was hoarse. There's nothing left here for you. There's everything here. Mary's eyes were fierce in the darkness. Someone needs to make sure your letters reach the right people. Someone needs to stay and tell the truth when they try to bury it. They'll punish you for helping me. Let them try. Mary embraced her quickly, fiercely. Now go, before I change my mind and drag you back myself. Vivian climbed into the coach, her body moving on autopilot while her mind struggled to catch up with what she'd just done. The door closed. The driver cracked the whip, and the coach lurched forward, carrying her away from the only home she'd ever known, toward a coast she couldn't see and a future that felt less like escape and more like free fall. She sat in the dark, listening to the wheels rattle over rough road, and tried to remember when she'd stopped being afraid of dying and started being afraid of living like this, always running, always one step ahead of consequences, always alone. The answer didn't come. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe this was just what happened to women who fought back. They won or they lost, but either way, they ended up here, in a coach racing toward exile, with nothing but the clothes on their back and the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them against her thighs, trying to stop the tremors, and felt something crackle in her pocket. Paper. She pulled it out, the letter from Mrs. Davies, creased and smudged from being clutched too hard. The words blurred in the darkness, but she didn't need light to read them. She'd memorized every line, every family evicted, every cruelty inflicted in her absence. The coach hit a rut and she slammed against the side wall, her shoulder taking the impact hard enough to make her gasp. The driver shouted an apology she barely heard. Her mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating distances and timing and the 100 ways this could go wrong. if the ship was delayed, if Cedric sent riders after her, if the authorities in London had already issued a warrant and coastal patrols were watching for her. If. She'd spent months living in ifs, had built her entire survival on contingencies and backup plans and the cold mathematics of staying one move ahead. And now she was gambling everything on a single desperate flight with no plan beyond reaching France and hoping the scandal she'd unleashed would be enough to protect the people she'd left behind. It was insane, reckless, the kind of thing a woman did when she'd finally realized that safety was a lie and control was an illusion, and the only real choice was whether to die quietly or die fighting. She chose fighting. Even now, racing through darkness toward probable exile, she chose fighting. And if that made her crazy or broken or too damaged to know when to quit, fine. She'd be all those things, as long as she was still breathing when the sun came up. Well, the coach reached the coast just before dawn, the sky bleeding gray-pink over black water that stretched to the horizon. The port was small, barely more than a fishing village with a single dock and a handful of ships bobbing in the tide. The driver pulled up near a tavern that smelled of salt and rotting fish, helped her down without meeting her eyes, and was gone before she could thank him. Vivian stood on the dock, her bag heavy in her hand, and looked for the ship Mary had mentioned. 3 vessels were anchored close enough to reach. A merchant brig, a fishing trawler, and a smaller passenger ship flying French colors, its gangplank already lowered for boarding. She walked toward it, her boots loud on the wooden planks, her pulse hammering in her throat. A sailor at the gangplank looked up as she approached. Young, maybe 20, with the kind of hard eyes that came from seeing too much too young. Passage to France. She kept her voice steady. I can pay. The sailor looked her up and down, taking in her travel-stained dress, her wild hair, the exhaustion carved into her face. We're full. I'll pay double the fare. Still full, triple. And I'll work. Cook, clean, whatever you need. She pulled coins from her pocket, thrust them at him. Please. He studied her for a long moment, then, Captain's already been paid for your passage. Mary sent word yesterday. He gestured toward the gangplank. Get aboard before someone decides to ask questions. Relief hit her so hard she nearly collapsed. She climbed the gangplank on unsteady legs, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Mary had planned this, had arranged everything while Vivian was busy burning her life down, had made sure there was a way out, even if Vivian was too reckless or too stupid to plan one herself. The ship was cramped, the passenger cabin barely large enough for 6 bunks and a table. 2 other travelers were already there, a merchant and his wife, both middle-aged and exhausted-looking. They glanced at Vivian when she entered, then went back to their own business. No questions, no curiosity, just the kind of weary indifference that came from people who'd learned not to care about other people's disasters. Vivian chose a bunk in the corner, dropped her bag, and sat with her back against the wall. Through the porthole she could see the dock, the tavern, the road she'd traveled. No constables yet, no riders. But dawn was breaking, and with it came visibility. If Cedric had sent men after her, they'd be here soon. The ship didn't move. Minutes crawled past like hours. Vivian's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging crescents into her palms. Why weren't they leaving? The tide was right. The wind was favorable. What were they waiting for? A shout from above deck. Running footsteps. Then the door to the passenger cabin slammed open and a sailor, different one, older, with a face like weathered stone, stuck his head in. Everyone stays below, no matter what you hear. The door slammed shut. Vivian's stomach dropped. She moved to the porthole, pressed her face against the glass, and saw them. 6 riders on the dock, constables by their uniforms, talking to the harbor master. One of them pointed toward the French ship. The harbor master shook his head, gesturing toward the other vessels. Lying. Buying time. But the constables didn't believe him. 2 of them started toward the gangplank. Vivian's pulse roared in her ears. She was trapped, caught. If they boarded, they'd find her, arrest her, drag her back to Yorkshire to face charges she couldn't fight. Everything she'd done, the confrontation at the manor, the letters, the desperate flight, would be for nothing. Above deck, the captain's voice. Loud, angry, telling the constables they had no authority to board a French vessel. The constables arguing back something about fugitives and jurisdiction and lawful pursuit, the argument escalating, voices rising, the whole situation seconds from violence. The merchant and his wife huddled together in their bunk, terror on their faces. Vivian stood alone, her mind racing. She could hide, barricade herself in the cabin, and force them to break down the door. She could surrender, walk out with her head high and accept whatever came next. Or she could... The ship lurched. Not much. Just a slight shift as the anchor line went taut. Then another lurch. Stronger. The vessel pulling away from the dock. They were leaving, with the constables still on the gangplank. Shouts. A scream. The sound of something heavy hitting wood. Vivian couldn't see what happened. The angle was wrong, the porthole too small. But a moment later, the gangplank splashed into the water and the ship surged forward, sails snapping open to catch the wind. They'd cut the line, left the constables on the dock, committed half a dozen maritime crimes to protect a passenger the captain had probably never met. Mary's work again. Had to be. She'd paid for more than passage. She'd paid for loyalty, for protection, for a crew willing to risk charges to get one desperate woman across the channel. Vivian sank onto her bunk, her whole body shaking with relief and exhaustion and something that felt like grief. She'd made it, barely. By margins so thin they might as well have been luck. But she was on the ship, and the ship was moving, and behind her, England was shrinking into morning mist. She'd escaped, for now. The crossing took 18 hours. Vivian spent most of it below deck, avoiding the merchant and his wife, trying not to think about what she'd left behind or what waited ahead. The cabin was stuffy, reeking of unwashed bodies and fear, but going above deck meant questions from the crew, and she didn't have answers that wouldn't make things worse. By the time they reached Calais, it was late afternoon, the sun slanting gold across a harbor that looked like every port she'd ever seen. Crowded, dirty, loud with languages she only half understood. The captain found her as they docked. "You'll want to disappear fast. Word travels. British authorities will be asking French counterparts about fugitives within a day." "I'm not a fugitive." The protest sounded weak even to her ears. "You cut and ran. That's fugitive enough." He studied her with something that might have been sympathy. "There's a coach in 3 streets north. They don't ask questions if you pay in advance. After that, you're on your own." "Thank you for everything. Don't thank me. Thank whoever paid double to make sure you made it." He turned away, then paused. "Whatever you did back there, I hope it was worth it." Vivian thought about the tenants, the letters, the look on Cedric's face when she'd exposed him in front of his guests. Me too. She left the ship with her single bag and walked into Calais like someone entering a foreign country for the first time, which she was. The streets were narrower than London, the buildings older, the air thick with the smell of baking bread and fish and something she couldn't identify. People stared at her. A lone woman, no companion, clearly English by her dress, dangerous in ways she was only beginning to understand. The coach inn was exactly where the captain said it would be. She paid for a week in advance, took a room on the 2nd floor, and locked herself inside. The room was small, barely furnished, but it had a bed and a window, and for the first time in 2 days, she felt like she could breathe without waiting for the world to collapse. She sat on the bed, pulled out Mrs. Davies' letter, and read it again. 3 families evicted. A dozen more facing the same fate. All because she'd walked away. All because she'd chosen survival over staying and fighting a battle she couldn't win. No. She'd chosen survival so she could keep fighting. That's what she told herself. That's what had to be true. Because if this was just running, if she'd abandoned those people for nothing, then what the hell was the point of any of it? She needed to know if the letters had worked, if the newspapers had printed them, if Parliament was investigating, if anything she'd done had mattered, or if she'd just created a scandal that would be forgotten in a week while Cedric went on destroying lives. But there was no way to know. Not from here. Not without contacts in London, resources, information networks. She had none of those things. Just a room in a French inn and enough money to last maybe 2 months if she was careful. After that, nothing. She lay back on the bed, stared at the ceiling, and tried to figure out what came next. Find work. That was step 1. Something that paid enough to keep her alive while she figured out how to get information from England. Seamstress, maybe. Governess? Something that kept her off the streets and out of sight. Step 2, survive long enough to see if her gamble paid off. Step 3, she didn't have a step 3. Couldn't see that far ahead. The future was a blank wall and she was running toward it blind. But she was running. That had to count for something. The first week in Calais passed in a haze of isolation and waiting. Vivian stayed in her room most days, venturing out only for food and to check the English newspapers at a cafe 3 blocks away. The owner was a Frenchman who'd lived in London for 20 years and kept a stack of week-old papers for expatriates. She read them obsessively, scanning every page for news about Yorkshire, about Cedric, about anything that might tell her if the letters had landed. Nothing. Not a word. Like none of it had happened. By the second week, her money was running low. She found work at a dressmaker's shop, hemming and mending for 12 hours a day in a back room that smelled of fabric dye and sweat. The pay was terrible. The work was mind-numbing. But it kept her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into the kind of dark places that ended with her walking into the ocean. The other seamstresses spoke French too fast for her to follow. They knew she was English. Her accent gave her away the first time she'd asked for work. But they didn't pry. Didn't ask why she was here or what she was running from. In a port city, everyone was running from something. She was just one more ghost among thousands. At night, alone in her room, she wrote letters to Mary. Long, rambling things she never sent because she didn't have an address, and sending anything to Yorkshire would only draw attention. But writing helped. Made her feel less alone, like she was still connected to something real, even if that connection only existed in words no one would ever read. She told Mary about Calais, about the dressmaker's shop and the cafe with the newspapers, and the way exile felt like drowning slowly in a language you couldn't speak. She told her about the nightmares, Cedric's face at the manor, the constables on the dock, the endless loop of running and never getting far enough ahead. She told her she was sorry for leaving, for dragging Mary into her disaster, for not being strong enough to stay and fight properly instead of burning everything down and running. She didn't mail the letters, just folded them carefully and kept them in her bag like evidence of a life she used to have. Oh. The news broke 3 weeks after she'd left England. She was at the cafe, nursing a coffee she couldn't afford, when she saw the headline, Duke of Ashcombe faces inquiry over tenant evictions. Her hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the paper. The article was short, clinical. It said members of Parliament had received letters alleging abuses at the Ashcombe estate in Yorkshire, that an inquiry had been opened, that the Duke had declined to comment, that sources close to the family suggested his estranged wife, or a woman who'd previously been accused of fraud, might be behind the allegations. It worked. God, it actually worked. The letters had reached the right people. Parliament was investigating. Cedric was facing scrutiny. Not justice. Not yet. But enough pressure that he couldn't keep destroying lives without consequences. Vivian read the article 3 times, then bought the paper and took it back to her room. She sat on the bed, the newspaper spread in front of her, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not relief, not triumph, just a bone-deep exhaustion that came from realizing she'd spent 3 weeks terrified her sacrifice had been for nothing, and now she knew it wasn't. It mattered. The people she'd left behind had a chance. But the article also named her, called her estranged, accused of fraud, a woman with an axe to grind and credibility problems. Cedric's lawyers were already spinning the narrative, turning her into the villain, the bitter ex-wife trying to destroy her husband out of spite. She'd expected that. But seeing it in print, seeing her name dragged through the mud while Cedric played the victim, made her want to scream, or cry, or get on the next ship back to England and finish what she'd started properly this time. She did none of those things, just folded the paper carefully and added it to the letters in her bag. Evidence. Proof that fighting back meant something even when you lost, even when you ended up alone in a foreign country with nothing. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks. More articles followed over the next month. The inquiry was expanding. Investigators had visited the estate, interviewed tenants, documented the evictions and rent increases. One article mentioned that several families had been reinstated after public pressure. Another said the Duke had agreed to roll back some of the more egregious changes. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But more than Vivian had dared hope for when she'd mailed those letters from a cottage on the coast. She kept working at the dressmaker's shop, kept reading newspapers, kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. The article that would announce she'd been charged with fraud, that British authorities were seeking her extradition, that everything was about to collapse again. It never came. By December, the scandal in England had faded to background noise. The inquiry concluded with a report criticizing the Duke's management but stopping short of formal charges. Cedric kept the estate. The tenants kept their homes. And Vivian kept sewing dresses in a back room in Calais, wondering if this was it, if this was what the rest of her life looked like. Exile and anonymity, and the slow realization that she'd traded everything for a partial victory that would be forgotten in a year. She told herself it was enough, that she'd done what she could, that survival was its own kind of success. But late at night, staring at the ceiling of her cramped room, she felt the hollowness again. The sense that she'd lost something fundamental in all the fighting, not just the estate or her marriage or her position, but some essential part of herself. The part that believed fighting back led to anything except more fighting. She didn't regret it, couldn't afford to. Regret was a luxury for people who had options. She'd used hers up years ago. But God, she was tired. The letter arrived in January, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finally reaching her. The handwriting was Mary's. Vivian tore it open, her hands shaking. Your Grace, I hope this finds you well. I'm writing with news I thought you should hear. The inquiry has done more than you know. 6 families were reinstated. Rents were lowered. And the Duke, there's talk in the village that he's planning to sell the estate. Parliament scrutiny has made him toxic. No one wants to associate with him. He's losing everything. The tenants wanted you to know. What you did mattered. It saved lives. I hope that brings you some peace. Your faithful servant, Mary. Vivian read the letter 3 times, then pressed it against her chest and cried. Not from sadness, from the sheer overwhelming weight of knowing that it hadn't been for nothing, that the people she'd tried to save were safer because she'd fought, that Cedric was finally facing consequences, that maybe, just maybe, she'd actually won something after all. She wiped her eyes, folded the letter carefully, and added it to the collection in her bag. Then she stood, washed her face, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The woman staring back was thinner than she remembered, harder. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. But there was something else too. Something she hadn't seen in months. Determination. She'd survived exile, survived isolation, survived the crushing weight of thinking her sacrifice had been meaningless. And now she knew she'd hurt Cedric. Maybe not destroyed him, but hurt him badly enough that he was losing the one thing he'd fought to keep. And if she'd done that from Calais, with no resources and no allies except Mary, what could she do if she actually tried? The thought was dangerous, reckless, the kind of thing that would get her arrested or killed or both. But it burrowed into her mind and wouldn't let go, because Cedric was weak now, vulnerable. And if there was ever a moment to finish what she'd started, to take back not just the estate but everything he'd stolen, it was now. She had no plan, no money, no legal standing, just rage and desperation and the knowledge that she'd already lost everything that mattered, which meant she had nothing left to lose. And people with nothing to lose were the most dangerous kind. She thought about the woman she'd been at the gala, standing in front of London's elite with a music box in her hand, refusing to be silent. Then the woman in the ballroom, exposing Cedric in front of his guests. Then the woman on horseback, racing across the moorland toward exile. Each time she'd thought that was the end, the final move, the last thing she had left to give. But she'd been wrong. There was always one more move, one more gamble, one more chance to fight back even when fighting seemed hopeless. She just had to decide if she was brave enough or broken enough to take it. The decision took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of going to work, reading newspapers, weighing options. 2 weeks of talking herself out of it, then back into it, then out again. 2 weeks of knowing that going back to England meant almost certain arrest, but staying in Calais meant living the rest of her life as a ghost. In the end, it wasn't a decision. It was an inevitability, because she'd never been good at accepting defeat, had never learned how to quit even when quitting was the smart thing. And some stubborn, reckless part of her refused to let Cedric keep the estate, refused to let him walk away with anything except ruin. She gave notice at the dressmaker's shop, packed her bag, counted her remaining money, barely enough for passage back to England and a week of food. Wrote one last letter to Mary, explaining what she was about to do and asking her to forgive the insanity. Then she boarded a ship bound for Dover, her heart hammering, her mind already racing ahead to what came next. She didn't have a plan, not a real one, just a destination and a goal. Get back to Yorkshire. Find evidence that would finish Cedric once and for all. Force him to sell the estate to someone who'd actually care for the tenants. And if she got arrested in the process, fine. At least she'd go down swinging. The crossing was rough. Winter storms turning the channel into a nightmare of gray water and howling wind. Vivian spent most of it below deck, sick and shaking, wondering if this was how her story ended, drowning in a storm because she was too stubborn to stay safe. But the ship made it. Limped into Dover Harbor on a freezing morning in late January, half the rigging torn, the crew exhausted. Vivian staggered onto the dock with her bag and immediately knew something was wrong. Constables. 3 of them. Watching the passengers disembark, looking for someone, looking for her. She froze, her mind racing. They'd been watching the ports, waiting for her to come back. Cedric must have kept the warrant active, must have known she'd eventually return. And now she was trapped on a dock with nowhere to run and 3 armed men between her and freedom. One of them looked her way. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face. He started toward her, hand on his truncheon. Vivian's pulse roared. She could surrender. Walk forward, hands up, accept arrest. Or she could run. Back toward the ship, into the crowd, anywhere except here. She ran. Shouts behind her, boots pounding on wood. She shoved through the crowd, her bag slamming against her hip, her lungs burning. The dock was chaos. Workers unloading cargo, passengers milling about, vendors hawking food. She ducked behind a stack of crates, then around a corner, then through a narrow alley that stank of fish guts and rot. The constables were right behind her. She could hear them shouting, could hear the crowd scattering. She burst out of the alley onto a street packed with carriages and horses and people. Saw an opening, sprinted toward it. A hand grabbed her arm. She screamed, twisted, broke free, kept running. Her vision was tunneling, black spots dancing at the edges. She couldn't keep this up, couldn't outrun them. They'd catch her within minutes, and it would all be over. A carriage pulled up beside her. The door flew open. A voice, female, urgent, shouted, "Get in!" Vivian didn't think, just dove through the open door, slamming against the opposite seat. The door slammed shut behind her. The carriage lurched forward, horses galloping, leaving the constables behind in a cloud of dust and confusion. She lay on the floor of the carriage, gasping, her whole body shaking. Someone was sitting on the seat above her. She looked up. Lady Margaret Hale stared down at her, eyes wide with something between shock and amusement. "Vivian." Margaret's voice was steady despite the chaos. "I was hoping you'd come back, but I didn't expect it to be quite this dramatic." Vivian struggled upright, her mind reeling. "What? How?" "I've been watching the ports for 3 weeks. Had a feeling you wouldn't stay gone." Margaret smiled. "Now sit down before you fall down. We have a lot to talk about." The carriage raced through Dover streets, heading inland, away from the constables and the docks, and everything Vivian had just escaped. She collapsed onto the seat, her heart still hammering, and stared at the woman who'd just saved her life. "Why?" "Because you fought back, and someone needs to finish what you started." Margaret's eyes were fierce. "But we're going to need help. And Vivian, this time we do it properly. No running, no half measures. We burn him down completely, or we don't burn him at all." Vivian looked at Margaret, young, determined, furious in the way only women who'd finally had enough could be, and felt something shift. She wasn't alone anymore, wasn't fighting this battle by herself. Somewhere between the gala and the exile and the desperate flight back to England, she'd found allies. Women who'd watched her fight and decided they were done being silent too. And if they were willing to risk everything to help her, if Margaret had spent 3 weeks watching ports, waiting for a fugitive to return, then maybe this wasn't over. Maybe there was one last move. One final gamble that could actually win. But it would require walking straight into the fire, facing Cedric on his own ground, risking not just arrest but everything Margaret and the others had built, and doing it without knowing if they'd win or just burn down together. Vivian met Margaret's eyes. If we do this, it ends with one of us destroyed. Maybe both. I know. Margaret didn't blink. I'm ready. Are you? Outside the carriage window, Dover disappeared behind them. Ahead, Yorkshire. The estate. Cedric. And the final confrontation that would either free her or destroy her completely. Vivian thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Broken and desperate. Then the woman at the gala. Fearless and reckless. Then the woman in exile, wondering if any of it had mattered. And finally, the woman sitting here now. Scarred, ruthless, absolutely done running. She looked at Margaret and smiled, sharp, dangerous, the smile of someone who'd lost everything and learned to fight without fear, because fear was just another thing that could be burned away. Yes, her voice was steady. Let's finish this. The carriage raced toward Yorkshire through winter rain that drummed against the roof like war drums, and inside 2 women planned the kind of destruction that only comes when people with nothing left decide the world needs to burn. The carriage drove through rain that turned the world into gray smears, and inside 2 women planned a war. Margaret had brought documents, thick folders stuffed with papers she spread across the seat between them. Evidence, testimonies from tenants, financial records someone had smuggled out of the estate offices, letters from lords who'd grown disgusted with Cedric's management and were willing to testify if it came to that. You've been building this for months. Vivian's voice was hoarse with something between awe and disbelief. Since the gala. Margaret didn't look up from the papers. When you exposed him that first time, you showed the rest of us it was possible, that we didn't have to accept their version of the world. She finally met Vivian's eyes. But you made one mistake. You fought alone. This time, we fight together. Who's we? 6 women, all married to lords with connections to Parliament, all tired of watching their husbands' friends destroy lives while everyone pretends it's normal. Margaret's smile was sharp. We've been documenting everything, building a case that can't be ignored or buried, but we needed you back. The woman who started this, the one who's willing to stand in front of them all and refuse to blink. I'm wanted for fraud. If I show my face, then we make sure the fraud charges look like what they are. A powerful man trying to silence his wife for exposing his crimes. Margaret leaned forward. Vivian, public opinion has shifted. The inquiry worked. People are asking questions now. And if we present this evidence properly, at the right moment, in front of the right witnesses, we can force a trial. Not of you, of him. The carriage hit a rut, and they both grabbed for stability. Outside, the countryside rolled past in shades of winter brown and gray. Yorkshire was close now. Maybe 2 hours. Vivian could feel it like a magnetic pull, dragging her back to the place that had been prison and kingdom and graveyard all at once. What's the plan? Margaret pulled out a single sheet of paper. Next week, Parliament holds a session on estate management reform. Half the lords will be there. We've arranged for testimony from Yorkshire tenants, documented abuses, financial mismanagement, everything Cedric's done since you left. She paused. And we want you there. Standing in that chamber, telling your story, not as a fugitive or a criminal, but as a woman who tried to save an estate from a man who was destroying it. They'll arrest me the moment I walk in. They'll try. But if we time it right, if you're already testifying when they move to arrest you, the optics become impossible. Arresting a woman mid-testimony about her husband's cruelty? In front of Parliament? Margaret's eyes glittered. It'll look exactly like what it is. Retaliation. Vivian stared at the paper, her mind racing through scenarios and outcomes. It was brilliant. Reckless and probably suicidal, but brilliant. If it worked, she'd force the establishment to choose between protecting Cedric and protecting their own credibility. And if enough lords had already turned against him, if the case Margaret had built was strong enough, they might actually choose justice. But if it failed, she'd be arrested mid-testimony and dragged out in front of everyone. The scandal would destroy what little credibility she had left, and Cedric would win. Again. What do the others say? The 6 women helping you, are they willing to risk this? They're already at risk. Margaret's voice was steady. Every one of them has put her name on these documents. If we fail, their husbands will know they helped. Some of them might lose everything, but they decided it was worth it, because someone has to be first. Someone has to stand up and say this isn't acceptable anymore. The weight of it settled over Vivian like a physical thing. 6 women. Margaret, Mary, all of them risking their positions, their marriages, their safety because she'd stood in a ballroom a year ago and refused to be silent. She'd thought that moment was about her, about exposing Cedric, about claiming power. But it had been bigger than that. It had been permission, proof that fighting back was possible. And now other women had taken that proof and built something that could actually change things. If she walked away now, if she stayed in exile and let them fight this battle without her, she'd be abandoning them the same way she'd abandoned the tenants, choosing safety over solidarity, surviving while others burned. She couldn't do that. Not again. Not when she'd already learned that surviving alone was just another way of dying. When do we testify? 6 days. Margaret folded the papers carefully. We have lodging arranged. Safe houses where you can stay until then. And we have a barrister willing to represent you if it comes to charges. He's good. One of the best. Why would he risk his career for this? Because his sister was married to a man like Cedric. She died 3 years ago, drank laudanum until her heart stopped. Margaret's voice went flat. He spent every day since wishing he'd helped her fight back. This is his chance to do it for someone else. Vivian closed her eyes, the weight of all these lives pressing down on her chest. A barrister with ghosts. 6 women with everything to lose. Margaret, young and fierce and willing to burn her own life down for a principle. And Vivian, the woman who'd started this mess, now being asked to finish it properly. She thought about the music box, about standing in that ballroom and watching her marriage detonate, about the months in exile, wondering if any of it had mattered. And she thought about what it would mean to walk into Parliament and face Cedric one last time, not in the dark, not running, but in daylight, in front of witnesses who couldn't look away. It terrified her, the kind of bone-deep terror that came from knowing you were about to gamble everything on a single moment that could go catastrophically wrong. But she was tired of being afraid, tired of running, tired of surviving when survival meant watching other people suffer in her place. All right, her voice was steady. 6 days. Let's make them count. Margaret smiled. Not the polite society smile Vivian remembered from their first meeting, but something harder, more honest. The smile of someone who'd decided that kindness without courage was just another form of cowardice. Outside, the rain turned to sleet. The carriage pushed forward through weather that felt like the world trying to stop them. But they kept moving, toward Yorkshire, toward Parliament, toward the confrontation that would either free them all or destroy them trying. The safe house was a tenant cottage on the edge of an estate owned by one of Margaret's allies, a lord whose wife had been in the group documenting Cedric's abuses. It was small, drafty, heated by a single fireplace that barely kept the winter at bay. But it was hidden, off main roads surrounded by fields, the kind of place no one would think to look. Vivian spent the first 2 days there recovering from the flight across the Channel and the chaos at Dover. Her body felt like it had been beaten, muscles aching, lungs raw from running, a persistent headache that wouldn't fade. But her mind was sharp, focused. For the first time in months, she had a purpose beyond just surviving. She had a target. Margaret visited daily, bringing documents for Vivian to review. Testimony transcripts, financial records showing exactly how Cedric had bled the estate, letters from lords expressing concern. Each piece of evidence was meticulously documented, cross-referenced, impossible to dismiss as hearsay or spite. You've built a fortress. Vivian looked up from a particularly damning ledger showing Cedric's gambling debts. This is better than anything I could have done alone, because it wasn't done alone. Margaret sat across from her, firelight making her look older, harder. That's what you taught us. Fighting back doesn't mean fighting alone. It means finding allies and refusing to let them divide us. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, sleet tapping against the windows. Finally, Vivian said, "What happens after? If we win, if Cedric is forced to sell the estate and I'm cleared of charges, what then? Then you decide who you want to be." Margaret's voice was soft. Not the Duchess, not the fugitive, not the woman defined by what was done to her. Just you, whoever that is. I don't know who that is anymore. Then you figure it out. Margaret smiled. You've got time. For the first time in a year, you'll have time. The thought was almost foreign. Time. Not running from creditors or constables or consequences, not fighting battles that couldn't be won. Just time to exist, to rebuild something that wasn't built on survival or rage or the need to prove she hadn't been destroyed. She didn't know if that was possible, if there was anything left inside her that wasn't scar tissue, but maybe that was the point. Maybe rebuilding meant starting with nothing and seeing what grew. On the fourth day, Mary arrived. Vivian heard the knock and opened the door to find her former maid standing in the sleet, a bag over her shoulder, her face set with determination. "Mary," Vivian's voice broke. "You shouldn't be here. If they trace you, then they trace me." Mary pushed past her into the cottage. "I've spent 4 months watching from the sidelines while you fought. I'm done watching." She dropped her bag, pulled off her soaked cloak, and stood there dripping on the floor. "I brought the last of the household records, everything I could smuggle out before the Duke locked down the offices. Payroll documents showing which families he cut off, correspondence proving he knew about the hardships and chose to ignore them." She met Vivian's eyes. "Whatever you're planning, I'm part of it." Vivian wanted to argue, wanted to send Mary away, keep her safe, protect her from what was coming, but she'd learned that lesson already. You couldn't protect people by excluding them from the fight. You could only fight beside them and hope you all made it through. She embraced Mary instead, hard and fierce. "Thank you for everything, for keeping me alive when I wanted to quit." "You don't get to quit." Mary pulled back, her eyes fierce. "Not after dragging the rest of us into this. Now we finish it. Together." That night, the three of them sat around the fire, Vivian, Margaret, and Mary, going over the testimony Vivian would give. It had to be precise, factual, no emotional appeals that could be dismissed as hysteria. Just the truth, laid out clearly, impossible to ignore. Vivian practiced it until her throat was raw. The debt, the forgeries she'd committed to save the estate, Cedric's betrayal when she'd come to him for help, the way he'd weaponized her crimes while hiding his own, the evictions, the suffering, all of it connected, documented, proven. By midnight, she had it memorized, could recite it in her sleep. Margaret declared her ready. Mary made tea, and they sat in the firelight, three women who'd survived different versions of the same war, preparing for the battle that would end it. Tomorrow, they'd travel to London. In 6 days, Vivian would walk into Parliament and face the men who'd built the system that had nearly destroyed her. And she'd force them to choose justice or complicity. There was no middle ground left. London in February was colder than Vivian remembered, the city wrapped in fog that turned buildings into ghosts and streets into labyrinths. They arrived 3 days before the testimony, staying in a townhouse owned by another of Margaret's allies. The place was elegant, well-appointed, the kind of home Vivian had once taken for granted and now felt alien in. The barrister Margaret had mentioned, a man named Thomas Hartley, came to meet her the day after they arrived. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 50, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He sat across from her in the drawing room and listened while she told her story. All of it, the betrayal, the fraud, the blackmail, the flight. He took notes, asked clarifying questions, and never once looked at her like she was crazy or broken. When she finished, he set down his pen. "Your Grace, I won't lie to you. This is going to be brutal. They'll question everything, your motives, your credibility, your sanity. And there's a real chance the fraud charges stick, regardless of how compelling your testimony is." "I know, but—" He leaned forward. "If we present this properly, if the evidence Margaret has gathered is as strong as she claims, we can shift the narrative. Make the trial about him, not you. Force Parliament to acknowledge that the system protecting him is broken. It won't be easy, but it's possible. What do I need to do? Tell the truth. Don't embellish, don't get defensive. Just lay out the facts and let them speak for themselves." He paused. "And prepare yourself for the possibility that you'll be arrested immediately after testifying. I'll file motions to prevent it, but I can't guarantee they'll work." Vivian nodded slowly. "If I'm arrested, what happens to the case against Cedric? It continues. Margaret and the others will keep pushing, but it'll be harder without you there to put a face on the suffering. That's why we need to make your testimony count." One chance. One moment. Make it impossible for them to look away. She thought about the gala, about standing in that ballroom with a music box in her hand, refusing to be silent. This would be the same, except bigger, more public, more permanent. If she did this right, she wouldn't just expose Cedric. She'd expose the entire system that had protected men like him while destroying women like her. And if she did it wrong, she'd be remembered as a bitter, unstable woman who'd committed crimes and then tried to justify them by blaming her husband. A cautionary tale about what happened when women stepped out of line. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders like iron. But she'd carried worse, had survived worse. And she was still here. "I'll be ready." Hartley stood, gathering his papers. "Good. Because they're going to come at you with everything they have, and you'll need to stand there and take it without flinching. Can you do that?" Vivian thought about the cottage in Calais, about sewing dresses for 12 hours a day while wondering if her life had been reduced to this, about reading newspaper articles that called her a fraud and a liar, about running from constables on a dock while the world collapsed around her. "Yes," her voice was steel. "I can do that." The morning of the testimony arrived gray and cold, fog thick enough to choke on. Vivian dressed carefully. A simple dark dress, no jewelry, her hair pinned severely. She needed to look credible, dignified, not like a woman who'd spent months in exile or who'd committed fraud to survive. Margaret and Mary helped her prepare, their faces pale with tension. None of them had slept. They'd spent the night going over every possible question, every attack the opposition might launch. By dawn, Vivian's voice was hoarse, and her mind was numb with exhaustion. But she was ready. The carriage ride to Parliament felt like traveling to an execution. Streets passed in a blur, people going about their lives, oblivious to the fact that in an hour, everything might change, or nothing might change. And Vivian would either walk out free or in chains. They arrived at the parliamentary complex just after 9. The building loomed massive and gray, columns like prison bars, the whole structure designed to make individuals feel small. Vivian climbed the steps with Margaret on one side and Hartley on the other, Mary following behind. Guards watched them pass. Clerks whispered, and somewhere inside, lords were gathering to hear testimony about estate reform. About her. They were led to a waiting room, small, windowless, a single bench against the wall. Hartley went to check on proceedings. Margaret and Mary sat on either side of Vivian, their hands clasping hers, holding her together through sheer proximity. "Whatever happens," Margaret said quietly, "you've already won. You've already proven that fighting back matters. The rest is just details." Vivian wanted to believe that, wanted to think that standing here preparing to testify was victory enough. But she'd learned the hard way that moral victories didn't change laws or protect tenants or stop men like Cedric from destroying lives. Real victory required consequences, and consequences required power. Today, she'd try to claim some of that power back. Try to force the men who'd built this broken system to acknowledge their complicity. And if they refused, if they arrested her and buried the evidence and protected Cedric because protecting him meant protecting themselves, then at least she'd know she'd tried. At least she'd know she hadn't gone quietly. Hartley returned. "They're ready for you." Vivian stood. Her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. Everything inside her was screaming, but her body moved with the kind of calm that came from accepting that this moment was inevitable. Had been inevitable since the night she'd opened that music box and found the portrait inside. She walked toward the chamber, Margaret and Mary behind her, and thought about every woman who'd ever been silenced, every wife who'd endured in private, every victim who'd been told her suffering didn't matter as much as protecting powerful men. This was for them. All of them. The ones who'd survived and the ones who hadn't. She stepped into the chamber and the doors closed behind her with a sound like a tomb ceiling shut. The parliamentary chamber was everything intimidating architecture could create. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, rows of seats filled with lords in formal dress, their faces ranging from curious to hostile. At the far end, a raised platform where she'd stand to testify. And in the third row, sitting perfectly still, Cedric. Their eyes met. His face was carefully blank, but she could see the rage beneath it, tightly controlled, waiting. He'd known she was coming, had probably spent days preparing counter-arguments and character assassinations. This was his territory, his world, and she was walking into it as a fugitive with nothing but the truth and the desperate hope that truth still mattered. She walked to the platform, her footsteps echoing, took her position, looked out at the sea of male faces, every one of them holding power she'd never have, and thought, "You're about to hear what that power costs." The magistrate, an older lord with white whiskers and cold eyes, spoke first. "State your name for the record." "Vivian Ashcombe, Duchess of Ashcombe. You stand accused of fraud. Multiple counts, forging your husband's signature on property transfer documents. Do you deny these charges?" "No." Her voice was steady. "I don't deny them." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Cedric's face showed the first hint of satisfaction. But Vivian wasn't finished. "I committed those acts to save the Ashcombe estate from my husband's gambling debts. Debts that totaled £47,000. Debts that would have resulted in creditors seizing the property and destroying the livelihoods of over 100 tenant families." The magistrate frowned. "That is a matter for your husband to address, not an excuse for criminal behavior." "It's not an excuse. It's context." She pulled the first document from the folder Hartley had given her. "This is a statement signed by the Duke acknowledging that he was aware of property liquidations and gave verbal consent. He only claimed fraud after I refused to relinquish control of the estate quietly." She handed the document to a clerk who passed it to the magistrate. He read it, his frown deepening, then passed it to the lord beside him. "The Duke claims this statement was coerced. Then let him testify under oath that he gave me no consent to act on his behalf when I was paying his debts." She turned, looking directly at Cedric. "Let him explain why he gambled away enough money to support the estate for 3 years. Let him explain the evictions, the rent increases, the families thrown out in winter because he needed quick cash to cover losses." Cedric stood, his face flushed. "My lord, this woman is attempting to justify criminal behavior by assassinating my character. She has no credibility." "I have testimony." Vivian's voice cut through his. "From tenants, from servants, from 6 lords whose wives documented everything you did after I left." She pulled out the stack of papers Margaret had compiled. "Financial records, correspondence, proof that you knew families were suffering and chose profit over people." The magistrate took the stack, flipping through pages. The chamber had gone silent. Every eye was on Vivian now, watching to see if she'd break or if this would actually land. She kept going. "I committed fraud. I acknowledge that. But I did it to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And when I came to my husband for help, he agreed to assist, then turned on me the moment I refused to surrender the estate. This isn't about justice. It's about a man using the law to punish his wife for refusing to disappear." "That's a lie." Cedric's voice was tight. "She's twisting." "Then let's examine the records." Vivian met his eyes. "Let's bring in the tenants and let them testify about conditions before and after my management. Let's review the financial statement showing exactly how you've bled the estate since I left. Let's put everything on the record and see who's lying." The magistrate looked between them, clearly unsure how to proceed. This was supposed to be a routine hearing about estate management reform. Instead, it had become a trial. A public airing of aristocratic dysfunction that most lords would prefer stayed buried. Finally, he spoke. "We will review the evidence presented. If it supports the Duchess's claims, we will open a formal inquiry into the Duke's management. However, the fraud charges remain. Regardless of motivation, forging documents is a crime." "I understand." Vivian's voice didn't waver. "I'm prepared to face consequences. But I want the full truth exposed first, not just my crimes. His too." Cedric stood again. "My lord, I demand that she be arrested immediately. She's a fugitive who fled England to avoid prosecution, and who returned voluntarily to testify." Hartley's voice rang out from the back of the chamber, surrendering herself to this body's jurisdiction. That hardly suggests someone fleeing justice. The magistrate looked genuinely torn. This was unprecedented, a noblewoman confessing to fraud while simultaneously accusing her husband of worse. A case that could either be dismissed as marital squabbling or could crack open questions about how power was used and abused throughout the aristocracy. We will take a brief recess. The magistrate's voice was careful. To review the evidence and determine how to proceed. The chamber emptied slowly, lords filing out in clusters, whispering. Vivian stood on the platform, her legs trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She'd done it, laid out everything, forced them to look at the evidence. Whether it would matter, whether they'd actually hold Cedric accountable, remained to be seen. But she'd said what needed saying, and she hadn't broken. Margaret and Mary reached her first, both of them speaking at once, their voices overlapping with relief and fear. Hartley appeared moments later, his expression cautiously optimistic. "You did well. Better than I expected." He glanced toward where Cedric had been sitting. "He's rattled. That's good. Rattled men make mistakes. What happens now?" "We wait. They'll review the documents, interview witnesses if they're serious about an inquiry, and they'll decide whether to arrest you immediately or let this play out." He paused. "I'd estimate 50-50 odds you walk out of here free." 50-50. After everything, after the flight and the exile and the desperate gamble of coming back. It came down to a coin flip. Vivian almost laughed. Almost. But the exhaustion was hitting her now, making everything feel distant and surreal. She sat down on the platform edge, her head in her hands, and tried to remember how to breathe. The recess lasted 2 hours. Vivian spent it in the waiting room, unable to eat, unable to think beyond the next 5 minutes. Margaret tried to distract her with small talk. Mary held her hand. Hartley paced, muttering to himself, running through legal arguments. When the clerk finally came to retrieve them, his face was unreadable. "The magistrate has reached a decision." They filed back into the chamber. It was more crowded now. Word had spread, and lords who hadn't been present earlier had shown up to witness the verdict. Vivian saw faces she recognized from the gala, from London society, from a dozen events where she'd smiled and played the role of the perfect duchess while dying inside. Now they'd see what that role had cost. The magistrate waited until everyone was seated. Then, after reviewing the evidence presented, this body has determined that a formal inquiry into the Duke of Ashcombe's estate management is warranted. We will interview tenants, examine financial records, and determine whether his actions constitute negligence or malfeasance. Relief washed through Vivian so strongly, she nearly collapsed. They were investigating. It had worked. However, the magistrate's voice hardened. The fraud charges against the Duchess remain. While her motivations may be understandable, the law is clear. Forging documents is a crime regardless of intent. Vivian's chest tightened. Here it came, the arrest, the trial, everything she'd expected. That said, the magistrate glanced at Cedric, then back to Vivian. Given the circumstances, the coerced nature of the Duke's initial complaint, the evidence of his own misconduct, and the Duchess's voluntary return to face charges, we are inclined toward leniency. The fraud charges will be reduced to a civil matter. The Duchess will pay restitution to any parties harmed by the property transfers, but there will be no criminal prosecution. The chamber erupted, lords shouting over each other, Cedric on his feet, his face purple with rage, demanding they reconsider. Vivian stood frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. No criminal prosecution, civil matter, restitution. She'd won. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to stay free. Enough to force the inquiry that would expose Cedric's corruption. Enough to prove that fighting back wasn't suicide. The magistrate banged his gavel. Order. We will reconvene in 2 weeks to begin formal hearings. Until then, both the Duke and Duchess are ordered to make themselves available for questioning. This matter is adjourned. Vivian felt Margaret's hand on her arm, steadying her. Felt Mary behind her, crying quietly. Felt Hartley's fierce whisper, "You did it! You actually did it!" But she couldn't feel anything except a vast, hollow exhaustion. She'd won. She'd survived. And she had absolutely no idea what came next. They left Parliament in a daze. Outside, fog was lifting, revealing a city that looked exactly the same despite everything that had just changed inside that chamber. Vivian stood on the steps, breathing cold air that tasted like freedom, and tried to understand what her life was now. Not a fugitive, not a criminal, Just a woman with civil penalties to pay and an inquiry to survive. A woman who'd burned down her marriage and her reputation and her safety, and somehow come out the other side still standing. Margaret hugged her hard. "You're free. Do you understand? You're actually free." Vivian nodded, but the word felt foreign. Free. She'd spent so long fighting that she didn't know how to exist without an enemy, didn't know what to do with days that weren't structured around survival. Mary touched her arm gently. "What now, my lady?" And that was the question, wasn't it? What now? She could return to Yorkshire. The inquiry would likely force Cedric to sell, and someone would need to ensure the new owner cared for the tenants. She could stay in London, rebuild connections, try to reclaim some version of her old life. She could disappear again, start over somewhere no one knew her story. Or she could do something entirely different, something she'd never allowed herself to imagine because imagining required hope, and hope had felt too dangerous. She looked at Margaret and Mary, the two women who'd risked everything to help her. Then at Hartley, who'd taken her case because his sister hadn't survived hers. Then at the Parliament building behind them, where a system built to protect powerful men had just been forced to acknowledge a woman's truth. "I want to help others." Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Women in situations like mine, like Genevieve, like your barrister's sister. Women who need someone to stand with them when they fight back." Margaret's eyes widened. "You want to, what, establish some kind of legal aid?" "Legal aid. Documentation. A network. Whatever it takes to make sure they're not alone the way I was." She looked at the building again. "What we did today, forcing them to listen, to investigate, to acknowledge the truth, we can do that for others. We can make it easier for the next woman." "It'll be dangerous." Mary's voice was worried. "You'll make enemies, powerful ones. I've already made them." Vivian smiled, tired but genuine. "Might as well make it count." They stood together on the Parliament steps, four people who'd fought a system designed to crush them and survived. Not unscathed, not victorious in any traditional sense, but alive, free, and ready to take what they'd learned and turn it into something that might protect others. That night, in the townhouse where they'd been staying, they began planning. Not revenge, not justice for justice's sake, but practical, concrete help for women trapped in situations where the law and society conspired against them. It would take time, resources, connections they'd have to build carefully. But it was possible. They'd proven that today. Vivian sat by the fire, a blank journal in her lap, and started writing. Not letters to Mary this time. Not testimony or confessions, just thoughts about what she'd learned, about survival and sacrifice and the difference between the two, about how fighting back didn't always look like winning, but sometimes looked like refusing to surrender, even when surrender seemed inevitable. She wrote until her hand cramped and the fire died down to embers. And when she finally closed the journal, she felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Peace. Not the absence of pain or struggle, but the knowledge that she'd done everything she could, that she'd fought as hard as she knew how, and that whatever came next, she'd face it with allies beside her, instead of alone in the dark. The inquiry into Cedric's management took 3 months. Vivian testified twice more, each time presenting evidence that made his negligence impossible to ignore. Tenants testified about evictions and cruelty. Financial experts documented the gambling debts and reckless spending. By April, the verdict was clear. Cedric had mismanaged the estate so severely that he was unfit to continue as its steward. Parliament forced a sale. The estate went to a lord from Scotland who'd made his fortune in industry and had progressive ideas about tenant relations. He kept most of the staff, rolled back the rent increases, and invited Vivian to consult on management practices. She declined. The estate was part of her past now. She couldn't go back to it without drowning in everything it represented. Instead, she stayed in London, took a small house in a quiet neighborhood, used the settlement from the estate sale, her portion, granted by the court as compensation for what she'd sacrificed, to fund the project she'd started planning with Margaret and Mary. They called it the Ashcombe Trust, a deliberately ironic name, an organization that provided legal assistance, safe housing, and financial support to women escaping abusive situations. They partnered with progressive barristers like Hartley, networked with women's groups across England, documented cases, and built a library of legal precedents that could be used to protect others. It was slow work, frustrating work. For every woman they helped, 5 more couldn't be reached. The system was designed to protect powerful men, and it resisted change with everything it had. But gradually, slowly, they made progress. One case at a time, one woman at a time. Vivian threw herself into it with the same ferocious energy she'd once used fighting Cedric. But this felt different, cleaner, like she was building something instead of just tearing things down. Like the wreckage of her marriage and her exile and her desperate gambles was finally being transformed into something that mattered beyond her own survival. She saw Cedric once more, 6 months after the sale. They passed each other on a London street, both stopping in mutual shock. He looked older, thinner. The confidence that had always defined him had curdled into bitterness. Vivian. His voice was flat. Cedric. They stood there, 2 people who'd destroyed each other, and Vivian felt nothing. No rage, no triumph, no satisfaction, just tired recognition of the wreckage they'd both become in the process of fighting. I hear you're doing charity work now. His tone suggested this was somehow worse than what she'd done before. I'm helping people you hurt. She met his eyes. That's not charity. That's accountability. He flinched. Then, I never wanted it to go this far. The words came out reluctant, like he hadn't meant to say them. If you'd just accepted the settlement, you'd have kept destroying lives. She kept her voice even. This was always going to end badly, Cedric. We were never going to survive each other. No. He looked away. I suppose not. They stood in silence for another moment. Then he walked away, disappearing into the London crowd. Vivian watched him go and felt a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness, she'd never forgive him for what he'd done, and he didn't deserve it. But release. The understanding that her life was no longer defined by him, that she'd moved beyond the woman who'd stood in that ballroom with a music box and nothing left to lose. She'd become someone new, someone who'd walked through fire and learned to rebuild from ash. Someone who knew that survival wasn't the same as living, and that real strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and choosing to keep going anyway. A year after the testimony, Vivian sat in the office of the Ashcombe Trust, reviewing case files. Mary worked beside her, managing correspondence. Margaret visited weekly, bringing new cases and updates on legislative efforts. They'd helped 37 women in the past year. 37 lives changed because someone had stood beside them and refused to let them fight alone. It wasn't enough. Would never be enough. But it was something. A legacy built not on power or position, but on the simple, radical act of believing women deserved better and being willing to fight for it. Late one evening, after everyone else had gone home, Vivian stood at the window of her office and looked out at London. The city where she'd been married, betrayed, destroyed, and somehow rebuilt. The city where she'd learned that surviving wasn't the same as thriving, but that thriving was possible even after everything had been taken. She thought about the girl she'd been at 19, hopeful and naive. Then the woman at 29, armored and slowly dying. Then the Duchess at the gala, refusing to be silent. The fugitive in Calais, wondering if anything she'd done mattered. The woman on the Parliament steps, learning that freedom was something you built brick by brick from the rubble of everything you'd lost. All those versions of herself, layered like scar tissue. Each one necessary, each one part of the journey that had brought her here. She was 41 now, no longer young, no longer innocent, marked by every battle she'd fought and every compromise she'd made, but alive, free, and building something that might outlast her. There was a knock at the door. She turned to find a young woman standing there, maybe 23, her eyes hollow with the kind of desperation Vivian recognized intimately. I was told you help women like me. The girl's voice shook. Women who need to get away. Vivian crossed the room, took the girl's hands in hers. Yes, we help. You're not alone. And as she led the girl to a chair, began asking the questions that would help them build a case, Vivian felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose that wasn't tied to her own survival. Strength that came not from never breaking, but from teaching others how to rebuild after the breaking was done. This was what she'd fought for. Not revenge. Not even justice in any traditional sense. but the chance to stand beside other women and tell them, you can fight back, you can survive. And when the world tells you that surviving means accepting abuse quietly, you can look them in the eye and say no. That was the real victory. Not what happened in Parliament or with Cedric or with the estate, but this moment, this choice, to take every brutal lesson she'd learned and use it to make the next woman's fight a little less lonely. She worked with the girl until midnight, documenting her case, planning next steps. And when the girl finally left, looking less desperate, more hopeful, Vivian sat alone in her office and thought about all the women who'd come before, the ones who'd fought and lost, the ones who hadn't survived their battles. She thought about Genevieve, somewhere in New York, building a life free from men who'd used her, about Lady Margaret's barrister's sister, who'd chosen laudanum over living in a cage, about every woman she'd never meet who'd faced the same impossible choices and made them alone in the dark. This was for them, all of them, the survivors and the casualties, the women who'd been told to endure and had endured until it killed them. Vivian stood, put on her coat, and walked out into the London night. The city was quieter now, fog rolling through streets that had witnessed 1,000 private wars just like hers. She walked past Parliament, past the building where she'd stood, and refused to be silenced, past the squares and streets where aristocrats held their glittering parties and pretended the world beneath them didn't exist. And she thought about power, real power, not the kind that came from titles or estates or the ability to destroy others, but the kind that came from surviving destruction and choosing to use that survival to protect others from the same fate. That was what she'd built from the wreckage. Not a dynasty, not a fortune, not revenge against everyone who'd wronged her, but a foundation, something that would outlast her, something that said, women fought back here. Women refused to be erased. And because of that, the world changed, slowly, painfully. But it changed. She reached the Thames, stood on the bridge watching black water flow beneath her, and thought about the woman who'd ridden across the moorland a year ago, racing toward exile, toward destruction, toward probable arrest. That woman had believed she was running from everything, but she'd been running toward this, toward the understanding that survival was just the first step, that real freedom came from taking what you'd survived and building something that made the next person's fight a little less impossible. The water flowed. The city breathed, and Vivian Ashcombe, no longer a duchess, no longer defined by what had been done to her, stood on that bridge and made a promise to every woman who'd come before and every woman who'd come after. I will not let your suffering be meaningless. I will take what I learned in the fire and I will use it to light the way for others. I will stand beside them when they fight back, and I will make sure they know they are not alone. The city didn't answer. It never did. But somewhere in the dark, another woman was making the same impossible choice Vivian had made a year ago. The choice to fight back even when fighting seemed suicidal. The choice to speak even when silence seemed safer. The choice to survive and then keep going beyond survival into something that looked like living. And when that woman needed help, the Ashcombe Trust would be there. Vivian would be there. Not as a savior, not as someone with all the answers, but as someone who'd walked the same path and knew that walking it alone was what made it unbearable. She turned from the river, headed home through streets that no longer felt like a prison, and she thought about the years ahead, the cases they'd take, the battles they'd fight, the women they'd help, and the women they'd fail to reach, and the slow grinding work of changing a system that didn't want to change. It would be hard. It would hurt. But she'd survived worse, and this time she wouldn't be surviving alone. This time, she'd be living. Finally. Truly. Completely. And that, after everything she'd lost and everything she'd learned, was worth more than any estate, any title, any marriage built on lies. She was free, and she would use that freedom to make sure others could be free too. That was the ending. Not revenge, not triumph, not even justice in the way she'd once imagined it. Just this, a woman who'd been destroyed and rebuilt herself into something stronger, not unbroken, never unbroken, but whole in a way that acknowledged the scars and wore them as proof that she'd survived. And in surviving, she'd learned the only lesson that mattered. You don't fight back to win. You fight back because the alternative is disappearing, and women had disappeared quietly for long enough. The world was changing, slowly, too slowly. But it was changing. And Vivian Ashcombe, survivor, fighter, builder of bridges from the wreckage of her own life, would make sure it kept changing until no woman had to face alone what she'd faced. That was the promise. That was the legacy. That was enough.